Part 4. The Practical Uses of Mental Illness. Chapter 9. Mental Illness as Strategy. You are to use the word purely as an incantation, if you like, purely for its selling power. C.S. Lewis. Sometimes the term mental illness is used as if it designated an identifiable condition like diabetes or a pattern of habitual behavior like neatness. An organic psychosis is indeed such a condition, and anorexia nervosa is indeed such a pattern of behavior. More often, however, the term refers to a strategy rather than a condition, exemplified by the Group for Advancement of Psychiatry's GAP definition of mental illness as an illness which so lessens the capacity of a person to use, maintain his judgment, discretion, and control in the conduct of his affairs and social relations as to warrant his commitment to a mental institution. The GAP advances this definition as if it were describing a disease, when in fact it is prescribing a disposition. Definitions: descriptive and dispositional. Every person of average intelligence and education knows that language may be used in two quite different modes, namely to assert or describe and to advocate or prescribe. For example, we can say, "The door is closed," or "Please close the door." Although the difference between these two modes of communication is obvious, misunderstanding or denying it lies at the heart of much of the confusion and controversy concerning psychiatric matters. As I have noted, the phrase mental illness appears to refer to a condition, but typically refers to a strategy. Or, to put it differently, mental illness terms are often used as if they were descriptions of psychopathological conditions from which individuals suffer, when, in fact, they function as prescriptions for how individuals allegedly suffering from such conditions should be treated by others. I point here to a simple, but officially forbidden, truth about psychiatry, namely, that its practitioners often first decide what to do about a person, and then discover the appropriate diagnostic label with which to justify their decision. For example, if a psychiatrist wants to commit a person, he discovers that the patient is dangerously psychotic. If he wants to get him acquitted of a criminal charge by reason of insanity, he discovers that the patient was at the precise moment of his criminal act suffering from a mental illness that deprived him of criminal responsibility. If he wants to provide an abortion for a woman in a country where the only legal abortions are those deemed to be therapeutic, then he discovers that she suffers from a mental illness for which the indicated treatment is an abortion. One of the advantages or disadvantages of focusing on the strategic meanings of mental illness terms is that it frees us from having to decide whether statements using such terms are true or false. The sentence, "Please close the door," is neither true nor false. Instead, it is a command or injunction, expressing a desire and prescribing an action. We may approve or disapprove the desire, obey or disobey the order. When asked to close the door, we may reply, "Yes, sir," right away. Or, "I understand you want the door closed, but I prefer that it stay open." Or, "If you want the door closed, you close it." However, it would be nonsensical to say, "You are right." Let us apply these considerations to some of the confusions concerning mental illness. Suppose someone says, "Jones suffers from schizophrenia." As a descriptive statement, we could agree or disagree and hence say something like, "Yes, you are right, he does," or "No, you have made a mistake, he does not." Both answers imply that schizophrenia exists, that Jones may or may not have it, and that even if Jones does not have it, some other people do. However, both answers are misleading and mistaken because the sentence "Jones suffers from schizophrenia" is only seemingly descriptive, but is actually prescriptive. Its prescriptive meaning may be any of the following. Jones should be confined in a mental hospital, should be acquitted as insane of the crimes he has committed, should not be taken seriously for the views he holds, and so forth. Once we have translated mental illness from description to prescription, we no longer have to accept or reject the assertion about mental illness. See Chapter 11. We are now liberated, so to speak, to respond to the injunction previously implicit but now explicit, with a clear rejoinder of our own concerning the recommended action. Perhaps the most obvious use of the idea of mental illness occurs in the context of commitment, exemplified in my initial example of the GAP's definition of it as, in effect, committability. To see clearly why this is not a definition of a condition, we need to construct an analogous definition of, say, myocardial infarction. A coronary occlusion would then be defined as a disease which so lessens the competence of a person's cardiac function as to warrant his observation in a hospital's intensive care unit. Although such a statement describes what may happen to a person as a consequence of his suffering a heart attack, no cardiologist would accept it as a definition of the disease called myocardial infarction. So, we must go back to our starting point, the fact that the central epistemological muddle of psychiatry derives from the fact that while the term mental illness seemingly refers to an abnormality or illness similar to or identical with a bodily disease, in fact it denotes no objectively identifiable condition or phenomenon. Accordingly, in keeping with the principle that the meaning of an abstract noun such as insanity must be inferred from its actual use, I shall now identify, describe, and illustrate the principal uses meanings of mental illness. Since mental illness functions mainly as a strategic term, I have already touched on some of its such uses, and will touch on others in the chapters that follow. Mental illness as accusation or incrimination. Descriptions of the psychoses in psychiatric textbooks are a rich source of illustrations of the accusatory uses meanings of mental illness terms, as the following cases, culled from Noy's Modern Clinical Psychiatry, 7th ed., illustrate. The first story begins with this sentence. PG was committed to a hospital for mental disease because of his peculiar religious ideas and rites, one of them being the practice of going about nude. If we look at this sentence without any psychiatric prejudgments, it makes very little sense. In the first place, every religious idea is peculiar to those who do not share it. Furthermore, in free societies, holding peculiar religious ideas is considered to be an essential aspect of individual liberty and political freedom. Lastly, the meaning of going about nude depends on the context. In one's own home, it is a right. In a public place, it is a crime. Thus, from the very first sentence of this case history, we are confronted with a psychiatric account that purports to describe an illness, psychosis, a so-called patient has, while actually it justifies an act in which a psychiatrist engages, commitment. In this account, we also get a glimpse of the collusion between patient and psychiatrist concerning the commitment. About this time, when he was 40 years old, he began to go to isolated spots and to walk about nude, explaining that he was taking sun baths. Gradually, he made fewer attempts to retire from sight when taking his sun baths. Finally, after having been warned on repeated occasions by the local constable that he must not continue his exhibitionistic practices, the patient was committed to a hospital for mental disorders. The method in this madness is obvious enough. Evidently, this person wanted to drop out of the game of competitive adulthood and proceeded to do so in the manner prescribed in our society. To show that this pattern is typical rather than isolated, I shall cite two more case histories from the same textbook, illustrating similar collusions between psychotic and psychiatrist culminating in commitment. The patient, AR, diagnosed as suffering from simple schizophrenia, was first a poor student and then a poor worker. When he reached the age of 19, he gave up his job as a machine operator in a factory and showed no further interest in securing employment. When asked if he worked, he replied, "What do I want to work for? I have a father and sister working, and they are enough." He appeared quite self-satisfied and felt that he should have a position of importance. At this point, AR was arrested for peeping into women's bedrooms. Through the influence of his father, the charge was dropped. A year later, he was again arrested, but again was released on the intercession of his father. Since these strategies failed to achieve what seemed to be their intended effect, the patient escalated his symptoms. He came to say little unless addressed, and grew antagonistic toward his father and sister. He would remain out until midnight, and then come home, eat a large meal, read until 2 a.m., and sleep until noon. Finally, after his third arrest for peeping, he was committed to a hospital for mental disorders. Such a case illustrates, comments Kolb, how an individual is unable to complete the transition from adolescence to maturity with its adult heterosexual and social adjustments. That may or may not be true. Kolb does not know, nor do I, whether this man was unable or unwilling to make this transition. In any case, I maintain that the imagery of illness and helplessness attached to such an individual functions as a justification for this particular psychiatric method of handling the problem. To be sure, in this sort of case, the patient incriminates himself as a mental patient. After he does so long enough and persistently enough, his self-incrimination is given official sanction. He is diagnosed as suffering from schizophrenia and is committed. The case history Kolb offers as typical of catatonic schizophrenia exhibits a similar pattern. The patient married when he was 20 and stopped working when he was 24. We are not told who supported him after that. What we are told is this. 2 months before commitment, the patient began to talk about how he had failed, had spoiled his whole life, that it was now too late. He spoke of hearing someone say, "You must submit." One night his wife was awakened by his talking. He told her of having several visions but refused to describe them. He stated that someone was after turn and trying to blame him for the death of a certain man. He had been poisoned, he said. He had periods of laughing and shouting and became so noisy and unmanageable that it was necessary to commit him. Again, the pattern seems clear enough. The patient produces symptoms which have the effect of coercing those about him to do something, hopefully to take care of him. Sooner or later, psychiatrists are called on to produce a diagnosis of mental illness, which has the effect of counter-coercing the patient into commitment. Some of the foregoing examples may seem dated, and indeed they are. I cite them to illustrate the paradigmatic strategic meaning use of mental illness. At the moment, it is legally and psychiatrically fashionable to commit only those persons whose mental illness renders them dangerous to themselves or others. Accordingly, psychiatrists now manipulate the psychiatric vocabulary so as to justify forcibly ejecting chronic mental patients from state mental hospitals, a process they call deinstitutionalization. Not surprisingly, people now complain that psychiatrists refrain too much from committing crazy people, with the result that the patients end up in prison. The following comment in the New York Times is typical. To get someone committed, the patient has to behave in a way that would get the same person arrested. Not eating, wandering the streets, refusing medical or psychiatric care are not considered legal causes for commitment. We criticize the Soviet Union for institutionalizing political dissidents while we send our mentally ill to prisons. The fact that the problems to which this writer refers have nothing to do with medicine, illness, and treatment, but have everything to do with poverty, homelessness, and social deviance seems to get lost in the effort, in which nearly everyone now seems to want to participate, to manipulate the psychiatric vocabulary, and with it, both the psychiatrist and the mental patient. Mental illness as excuse or exoneration. For obvious reasons, mental illness terms are used to excuse or exculpate only in situations where a person has committed an illegal act or is accused of having committed such an act. People do not plead insanity for engaging in legal acts or meritorious deeds. Before it was fashionable to plead insanity, it was customary to plead demonic possession. Indeed, current pleas of insanity do not differ much from old-fashioned pleas of demonic possession, as the following stories illustrate. In 1974, a 47-year-old Phoenix, Arizona man rammed his car into the front door of St. Francis Xavier Catholic Church, then ran up the aisle and began destroying altar pieces. It took 8 parishioners to restrain him. The police took him to the local psychiatric hospital, where he told the officers, "I was possessed by the devil, and he made me do it." The same claim made in 1981 by a young man in Connecticut charged with murder was supported not only by his relatives and friends, but by his attorney as well. On February 16, 1981, Arne Cheyenne Johnson got into an argument with Alan Bono and stabbed him to death. According to the New York Times, the case involves a family that seems utterly convinced of the devil's presence in their house and a defense attorney who intends to force evidence of that influence onto the court. The courts have dealt with the existence of God, says Martin Minella, the attorney. Now they're going to have to deal with the existence of the devil. Johnson's girlfriend, Deborah Glatzel, told the lawyer and the reporters that her brother had said that he had seen the beast devil go into Cheyenne's body and it was the beast who had committed the crime. The reporter for the Times notes that this case arises at a time when there is a growing belief in the country in religion and cites a national Gallup poll which showed that 34% of adults believe that the devil is a personal being who directs evil forces and influences people to do wrong. Of course, most of the remaining 66% of adults no doubt know it is mental illness that does it. In 1980, Michael Tyndall, who had served as a helicopter pilot in Vietnam, was charged with taking part in smuggling hashish from Morocco to Gloucester, Massachusetts. He insisted that he did it because of a need to relive the excitement he experienced in combat, and that this need was a symptom of his illness, the Vietnam Syndrome. In September 1980, a federal court jury in Boston acquitted Tyndall of the charges against him. It was, reported a combined AP-UPI dispatch, the first time the Vietnam Syndrome, an emotional malady recognized by the American Psychiatric Association and the Veterans Administration as post-traumatic stress, had been used successfully as a defense in connection with a premeditated crime. The assertion that being possessed by mental illness, rather than by the devil, excuses one from crime is stated in a more pretentious way by various legal formulas for determining the criminal responsibility of persons suspected of being insane. The Durham Rule, for example, asserts that an accused is not criminally responsible if his unlawful act was the product of mental disease or mental defect. It is important to keep in mind that all tests for the criminal responsibility of allegedly insane defendants rest on the premise that mental illnesses exist and cause people to commit illegal acts. While such a strategy of psychiatric mercy may now seem humane or even scientific to many people, it is in fact neither, as William Blackstone, the great English jurist, recognized more than 200 years ago. But this excuse, lunacy, ought not be strained to the length to which our coroner's juries are apt to carry it, viz., that every act of suicide is an evidence of insanity, as if every man who acts contrary to reason had no reason at all. For the same argument would prove every other criminal non compos, as well as the self-murderer. Blackstone was referring, of course, to the novel strategy of evading the harsh punishments of the law against suicide by posthumously diagnosing the Reshming, offender victim, as a lunatic. Perhaps because in those cases there was no question of psychiatrically examining the so-called patient, the strategic character of the diagnosis was clearer then than it is now. Indeed, the evidence suggests that the strategic character of the idea of mental illness has been successfully obliterated from the consciousness of the modern intellectual. Consider by way of example the debate now raging among psychiatrists, medical ethicists, lawyers, and television commentators concerning the latest psychiatric dilemma, namely mental illness in a death row inmate. Can a mentally ill person be executed? If not, should he receive appropriate treatment so that he may be? This dilemma derives from the fact that, in American law, sanity is a requirement not only for executing a valid last will, but also for being validly executed. This requirement rests on two interconnected premises. One is that it is considered morally wrong to execute a person who does not understand he is about to die or the reasons for it. The other is that a seriously mentally ill person is considered to be just such a person. Obviously, this situation represents an irresistible invitation to death row inmates as well as their self-appointed benefactors for offering mental incapacity as an excuse. If the prisoner does not want to be executed, all he has to do is act crazy. If his lawyer does not want him executed, all he has to do is claim his client is crazy. In either case, officials are confronted with the question, is the prisoner psychiatrically fit to be executed? Is he genuinely insane or only faking insanity? See Chapter 5. As we saw, it is not easy to tell the difference. Lay people can't do it, lawyers can't do it, only psychiatrists can do it. Here is a current example. In 1974, Alvin Ford, then 24, killed a policeman while robbing a Red Lobster restaurant in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, tried and sentenced to death. Ford has spent the past 11 years on death row in the Florida State Prison. I do not know whether Ford prefers to be executed or imprisoned for the rest of his life. All I know is what I read in the newspapers, which say that Ford's lawyers claim he is insane and hence mentally unfit to be executed. Although lawyers and legal scholars never tire of telling us that insanity is a legal term without psychiatric significance, no sooner do they raise the question of insanity than they call for psychiatrists to verify their claim. Ford's lawyers hired some shrinks who, not surprisingly, found Ford to be stark raving mad, a paranoid schizophrenic, so armed. Ford's lawyers petitioned Governor Robert Graham to declare Ford unfit for execution. What could the governor do but hire his own shrinks? He got 3 of them. They examined Ford, and mirabile dictu, all 3 found him to be fit as a fiddle for execution. Does this mean that they found him to be sane? Not quite. No red-blooded American psychiatrist finds anyone sane, much less a murderer. Sane people don't kill. Only insane people do. Every sane person knows that. So what did these scientists of the mind find? Before answering this question, let me mention the behavior Alvin Ford is allegedly exhibiting. Undoubtedly, by our usual standards of behavior, Ford is acting pretty crazy. The trouble is, we have no criteria for what constitutes normal behavior on death row. What would psychiatrists consider to be mentally healthy behavior on the part of a person who has seen fellow inmates executed and twice come within hours of execution himself, as Ford has? Actually, anyone familiar with Freudian ideas concerning adaptation to extreme stress by denial might say that Ford has coped quite well. He states, "I am not going to die. I'm the one who's in charge here. I make them put people in jail. I'm going to decide who gets killed." According to court records, when one of the state-appointed psychiatrists asked him, "Are you crazy?" Ford replied, "Are you crazy?" What then did the governor's psychiatrists find? 2 found him to be psychotic, but competent for execution. The 3rd concluded that Ford's disorder was contrived and recently learned, in short, that he was malingering. He too found Ford to be mentally competent to be executed. Ford's fate is now in the hands of America's demigods, the justices of the United States Supreme Court. They are, of course, experts on mental illness, just as they had been experts on slavery. See Chapter 11. To assist them in their deliberations, the APA lost no time filing an amicus brief on behalf of Ford. A 30-minute interview, complained the psycho quacks, is inadequate to determine a prisoner's competency to be executed and violates his due process rights. This assertion implies that a longer and differently structured interview would be adequate for determining, by psychiatric methods, whether or not a prisoner is mentally competent to be executed. We have been through this before. First, the psycho quacks claimed special professional competence to determine whether a defendant, at the precise moment when he committed a crime, could or could not form the intent to commit a crime. Then, they claimed such competence to determine whether a defendant, at the time of trial, is or is not mentally fit to be tried. Now, they claim such competence to determine whether a prisoner on death row is or is not mentally fit to be executed. I continue to maintain, however, that unlike the competence of the kidneys to secrete urine, competence to be executed is not the sort of thing for which a physician can examine a patient. The psychiatric examination is a charade to obscure the practical and moral problems at hand and the strategic character of the psychiatric intervention used to evade it. The stupid mistake or stubborn strategy, the reader must decide which of viewing insanity as a treatable illness rather than as a tactical maneuver leads to an important further step in cases such as Ford's. Several such cases have been reported in the press during the past year. A prisoner on death row awaiting execution presents a practical problem for the authorities, such as governors and justices of the Supreme Court, who are, de facto as well de jure, in charge of his life and death. They have only 2 options. They must treat the prisoner either as sane and fit for execution or as insane and unfit for it. If they decide he is sane, they choose to execute a man who has been declared to be mentally ill and unfit for execution by, so some will say, conscientious, honorable, incorruptible medical professionals. On the other hand, if they decide he is insane, then according to currently prevailing forensic psychiatric standards and policies, they are obligated to ensure that he receives appropriate psychiatric treatment for his illness, no doubt from equally conscientious, honorable, incorruptible medical professionals. For what ultimate purpose? To make the prisoner sane enough so that he can be killed with the blessings of the rule of American law and the science of American psychiatry. Although this dilemma clearly exposes the absurdity of the claim that mental illness is an illness, like any other, and although it clearly reveals that, under such circumstances, the claim of mental illness or mental health functions as a purely strategic device, all this is not only ignored, but inverted into further evidence of our need for psychiatric expertise. Indeed, the existential cannibals are already feasting on their prey. How, ask two experts on such matters, will the staff of a state mental hospital respond when they realize that successful treatment means the patient will die? Moreover, according to a report in Psychiatric News, the patient's right to refuse treatment and the issue of informed consent further complicate such cases. But not to worry, the experts have a solution. All inmates found incompetent to be executed should automatically be sentenced to life imprisonment. Otherwise, treatment of such prisoners would erode hospital morale. Can the fakeries of psychiatry become any more brazen than this? I submit that instead of asking priests how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, we are now asking psychiatrists whether it is ethical for a physician to restore the sanity of an insane inmate on death row. The CAT scan, no doubt, will give us the answer. Mental illness as denial of moral conflict and evasion of personal responsibility. The acts of accusing and excusing, inculpating and exculpating usually involve clear-cut issues and situations in which individuals are blamed or forgiven. But in certain situations involving moral conflicts and questions of personal responsibility, the lines between good and evil, right and wrong, legal and illegal, are not so neatly drawn. In these situations, too, mental illness terms may be used strategically to obscure guilt, to resolve ambivalence, to bring about a result justified by compassion, and so forth. Long before the days of modern psychiatry, Shakespeare laid bare this tactical use of the idea of madness. Aided and abetted by his wife, Macbeth murders his way to the pinnacle of political power. His victory is spoiled, however. Lady Macbeth starts to hallucinate blood on her hands, is tormented by anguish, cannot rest or sleep. Her husband concludes that she is sick and sends for the doctor. But the doctor wants none of it. He tells Macbeth that his wife is not so sick, my lord, as she is troubled with thick-coming fancies that keep her from her rest. Macbeth is not satisfied. He presses the doctor with these immortal lines. Cure her of that. Canst thou not minister to a mind diseased? Pluck from the memory a rooted sorrow. Raise out the written troubles of the brain. End with some sweet, oblivious antidote. Cleanse the stuffed bosom of that perilous stuff, which weighs upon her heart. The doctor, however, recognizes that what ails this patient is not a disease. His famous answer is, therein the patient must minister to himself. Lady Macbeth is not sick. She feels guilty for the wrong she has committed. Her husband knows this, but does not want to admit it. The modern psychiatrist and the modern popular mind accept and legitimize precisely that intellectual and moral evasion which the doctor in Macbeth repudiates. One of the crassest examples of the use of mental illness terms to obscure moral conflicts and avoid political decision-making occurs in the relationship between psychiatrists and pregnant women. Since times immemorial, some pregnant women and their husbands or lovers have sought abortions. Until recently, performing abortions was medically unsafe as well as legally prohibited. In the post-World War II years, it became fashionable, in the United States as well as elsewhere, to allow pregnant women to have therapeutic abortions based not only on objectively verifiable medical criteria, such as severe renal disease with hypertension, but also on subjective and unverifiable psychiatric criteria, such as mental illness. For example, in 1968, a new abortion law was enacted in California permitting therapeutic abortions on mental health grounds. During the first 6 months of that year, almost 2,000 women were found to require therapeutic abortions to safeguard their mental health, while only 155 abortions were done to safeguard a woman's physical health. By the time the first 9 months of 1968 had elapsed, 5,000 therapeutic abortions were performed in California, virtually all of them for psychiatric reasons. In the 1970s, when abortion was legalized, the psychiatric disabilities so common to pregnant women disappeared just as suddenly as they had appeared 2 decades earlier. Thus, whenever and wherever abortion on demand is illegal, but psychiatric therapeutic abortion is legal, the psychiatrist who prescribes an abortion follows in the footsteps of the physician who, during Prohibition, prescribed liquor. Another arena in which mental illness terms are used to obscure moral conflict and evade personal responsibility is in connection with so-called drug abuse. The use of illegal psychoactive substances is now widespread throughout the world. Although it is obvious that no one is compelled to use such substances, and that therefore, in the final analysis, people take drugs because they want to take them, and although it is also obvious that there are many complex cultural, religious, and legal reasons for the so-called drug problem, it is now fashionable to attribute the problem to the drug-abusing person's mental illness. In addition, it is also fashionable to blame the drug itself and those who make it available, both the dope and the pusher being viewed as seducers infecting innocent individuals who then succumb to the mental illness called addiction. Mental illness as denial of human depravity. The last strategic use meaning of mental illness that I want to identify is its invocation to deny the depths of human depravity. We encounter this use of the term typically when a shocking crime, usually dubbed bizarre by the press, is committed, and when the agent of that deed, though unknown, is instantly diagnosed as deranged or psychotic. Revealingly, the press often relapses into making use of the vocabulary of the alienists and mad doctors in describing these alleged mental patients. A typical story, appearing on page 1 of the New York Post on November 13, 1980, was headlined, "Angels Stalk Mad Slasher." The subtitle added, 350-man patrol hunt for knife maniac. This story concerned the search for a knife-wielding assailant who terrorized the Lower East Side of Manhattan and remained at large despite an intense effort to find him. A similar story appeared in the Syracuse Post-Standard on October 10, 1980, a page 1 headline informing the reader, "Cops Hunt Psycho in Slaying of 2 in Buffalo." The first sentence of the UPI story explained further. Several Buffalo area law enforcement agencies joined forces Thursday in a hunt for a deranged, mentally disturbed person who killed 2 black cab drivers and cut their hearts from their bodies. The authorities had no idea who the killer was. All they knew was that he was a psycho. The New York Times uses more elegant language in reporting this sort of news. One of its typical headlines, placed discreetly on page 16, capping a story about a series of bizarre murders, reads as follows. Disturbed suspect is sought in 7 ritualistic killings of coast hikers. The report concerned the murder of 7 women over a period of 15 months along the hiking trails near San Francisco. Although in this case, too, the identity of the killer or killers was an utter mystery to the authorities, the Times tried to tranquilize its readers with the following account. Although there were some dissimilarities in the cases, the 2 decomposing bodies were fully clothed, for example, while the latest victims were apparently forced to disrobe. Sheriff Hauenstein said that the evidence pointed strongly to a single, severely disturbed killer. Note that these killings are called ritualistic, to insinuate the idea that the killer is insane. But it seems to me more obvious that what is ritualistic about this and similar cases is not the manner in which the crimes are committed, but the manner in which they are reported. Mental illness terms being used ritualistically to distract the reader from the evident depravity of the men and women who commit such crimes. I wonder indeed what sort of evidence Sheriff Hauenstein and other true believers in mental illness would interpret as pointing strongly toward a mentally healthy mass murderer as the culprit. Citing Sheriff Hauenstein's opinion about the mental ill health of this unknown killer was, moreover, merely the warm-up. The Times had an even more qualified authority on mental illness waiting in the wings to offer an opinion about the killer. A criminal psychologist's interpretation of evidence collected over the last year also indicated that the killer's mental state was further deteriorating. The 2 murders Friday may have been an effort to call attention to the earlier murders in the same area. These pathetic fantasies are offered to insinuate the idea, now dear to the hearts of American madness mongers, that every depraved act is a cry for help by a victim. But this is a truly perverse interpretation, distracting the observer's attention from the actual victims of crimes by portraying their perpetrators as themselves the victims. Hardly a day passes without the newspapers reporting similar stories couched in such language. What should we make of them? As one see it, such accounts are simply reports of a type of behavior we colloquially call sickening, that is, so disgusting and upsetting that it makes us sick. Of course, the term sick here is used as a metaphoric adjective, intuitively recognized as such by any competent speaker of the English language. So far, probably no one will refute my interpretation. However, my next step, although equally obvious, is more likely to be rejected. I suggest that the idea that these unknown criminals engage in acts that are sickening, or that they themselves are sickening, has been transformed into the idea that they are really sick. But these persons are sick not in the sense in which persons with cancer or heart disease are sick, but only in the sense in which persons who are lovesick are sick. See Chapter 5. Mental illness, strategy, self-deception, deception. I hope I have succeeded in demonstrating that professionals as well as lay people now feel comfortable using a multiplicity of diverse criteria for determining what counts as mental illness. See Chapter 3. And then using that idea to achieve a variety of personal and social goals. Surely, one of the things we can conclude from this is that we have abandoned, assuming we had once begun, defining mental illness descriptively, and have taken, like a duck to water, to defining it strategically. Although my thesis about mental illness as strategy may be persuasive, I realize that it suffers from a fatal flaw. It is too obvious. On the one hand, everyone now seems to believe in mental illness. On the other hand, hardly anyone acts as if he really believes in it. Consider the evidence. 60 million Americans are estimated to smoke cigarettes. They are mentally ill, suffering from tobacco dependence. 30 million Americans are said to use illegal drugs. They are mentally ill, suffering from drug abuse. 4 million Americans are supposed to have schizophrenia. This disease is generally acknowledged to be the #1 health problem in the United States. Leaders in medicine, psychiatry, government, education, industry, and labor ceaselessly proclaim that mental illness is like any other illness. Nevertheless, responding to a Gallup poll survey asking Americans, "What disease or illness do you fear the most?" the respondents placed cancer on top of the list, blindness halfway down the middle, and deafness at the bottom. Mental illness was not on the list at all. In short, the meaning of the phrase menial illness, like the meaning of any other ideologically loaded symbol, depends on what those who use it want it to mean. Obviously, the ritualistic use of this term means one thing to true believers in psychiatry, and quite another thing to those who reject the dogma of the transubstantiation of personal problems into medical diseases. Cui bono? As I have noted at the beginning of this chapter, one of the crucial differences between descriptive and prescriptive statements is that while the former may be said to be true or false, the latter may only be said to be desirable or undesirable. This distinction is dramatically revealed in the history of Christianity. From its inception until the dawn of the Enlightenment, belief in God and Jesus was premised on the conviction that the scriptures and the teachings of clerics were true. Since the end of the age of faith to our own day, religion has been defended not so much as true, but as useful. Of course, long ago Plato called salutary myths noble lies. Nietzsche aptly renamed them holy lies. The psychiatric myths, useful for supporting faith in the myriad pseudo-medical procedures of the therapeutic state, are our noble, holy, therapeutic lies. One of the most important differences between whether a statement is true or useful is that truth is typically impersonal and universal, whereas usefulness is not. If a person asserts that lead is heavier than water, it is senseless to ask the classic Roman question, cut bono, who profits from it? Whereas if a person asserts that alcoholism is an illness, it is very sensible indeed to ask cui bono, I have devoted much of this work, and especially this chapter, to showing the importance of asking and enswearing this question whenever a person or group advances a claim clothed in the mantle of mental illness. Hobbes, whom I often cite in this book, concluded Leviathan by urging precisely this point of view on his readers. By substituting clinical for clerical images and words in his text, his message is as timely now as it was in 1651. He that received benefit by a fact is presumed to be the author. Cicero makes honorable mention of one of the Cassi, a severe judge amongst the Romans, for a custom he had in criminal causes, when the testimony of the witnesses was not sufficient, to ask the accusers cui bono, that is to say, what profit, honor, or other contentment the accuser obtained or expected by the fact. For amongst presumptions, there is none that so evidently declared the author, as doth the benefit of the action. And therefore by the aforesaid rule of cui bono, we may justly pronounce for the authors of all this spiritual darkness, the Pope and Roman clergy, and all those besides, that endeavor to settle in the minds of men this erroneous doctrine, that the Church now on earth is that kingdom of God mentioned in the Old and New Testament. This may sound old-fashioned, but if so, it is only because of the language. We now have our own expression for cui bono, the bottom line. The bottom line indeed remains. Who profits, in our case, from the psychiatric ideas and interventions so strenuously promoted in the modern world? Hobbes, of course, always saw the struggle for power as the hidden agenda behind clerical fraud and force disguised as benevolence, and we could do worse than heed his advice. But cui bono, what profit did they the presbytery expect from it? He writes in one of his typical passages. The same which the popes expected, to have a sovereign power over the people. This formula is still valid. We must extend it, however, because today, in addition to psychiatrists, many others use psychiatric ideas and interventions to gain power over their adversaries or secure other advantages for themselves. Chapter 10. Mental Illness as Justification. The liver, skin, and kidneys should be stimulated to activity and be made to assist in decarbonizing the blood. The best means is to put the patient to some hard kind of work, as chopping wood, splitting rails, or sawing with the crosscut or whipsaw. The compulsory power of the white man, by making the slothful Negro take active exercise, puts into active play the lungs, through whose agency the vitalized blood is sent to the brain to give liberty to the mind. Samuel A. Cartwright, M.D., 1851. Because human life is basically social, every group possesses certain methods for ensuring the role conformity of its members. Because human behavior is basically goal-directed, there are two fundamental methods for encouraging or enforcing role conformity: the carrot and the stick, reward and punishment, blandishment and coercion. Although coercion is accordingly one of the most important facts of life, modern psychiatrists prefer to avert their eyes from it. This was not always the case. During the infancy and childhood of psychiatry, that is, from 1650 until 1800, alienists and madhouse keepers frankly acknowledged that they controlled their patients by force. Since all insane persons were then treated as involuntary patients, those in charge of them could hardly have done otherwise. However, as psychiatry became medically more legitimate and socially more acceptable during and since the second half of the 19th century, its practitioners sought increasingly to obscure or even deny that much of what they did, ostensibly for the patient, was imposed on him by force. In the 20th century, the psychiatric campaign to analogize psychiatric practices vis-à-vis involuntary patients with medical practices vis-à-vis voluntary patients has been crowned by almost complete success. Since about the middle of this century, the very mention of psychiatric coercion has become taboo. If the person who mentions this aspect of psychiatry is a layman, psychiatrists regard his comments as an unjust and hostile criticism of the profession. If he is himself a member of the profession, then psychiatrists regard his comments as a symptom of unforgivable disloyalty, or worse. The concept of coercion implies two closely related notions, namely power and freedom. One person, Jones, cannot coerce another. Smith, unless he has power over Smith, a weaker person cannot literally coerce a stronger one. Conversely, Smith cannot be coerced by Jones unless Smith has certain aspirations and desires, typically to be free to live, possess property, and pursue happiness. A person devoid of all wants, indifferent to whether or not he lives or how he lives, cannot be coerced. This explains why in the West people have sought to protect themselves from coercion by political means, principally by restraining the powers of the state, limited government, while in the East they have sought to protect themselves by spiritual means, principally by limiting their own desires, nirvana. The religious justification of coercion. Since Western ideas about freedom and power derive in large part from Jewish and Christian religious traditions, let me first offer some brief remarks about these creeds. Viewed as a literary and political document, one of the striking features of the Old Testament is its preoccupation with power and powerlessness. That is, with God's power to create, destroy, and control, and with man's powerlessness, as man vis-a-vis God and as slave vis-a-vis master. It is here, at its very roots in the Judeo-Christian heritage, that an important ambivalence or double message about domination and submission enters the picture. One message is that God's total power and man's complete submission to him is a good thing. The other is that man's power over his fellow man, in particular, the power of the Egyptian pharaohs over their house, Jewish slaves, is a bad thing. The story of Exodus may thus be viewed as, among other things, an expression of the fundamental aversion human beings experience when other human beings deprive them of their power of self-determination. Yet, as we know, it would be very wrong to say that the Old Testament story condemns slavery as such, that is, as a social arrangement or institution. Exodus implies only that slavery was a wrong for the Jews at that particular time in their history. Coercion in Jewish and Christian history. Although the historical Jewish attitude towards slavery does not differ significantly from Christian or Mohammedan attitudes toward it, something else in the Jewish attitude toward the use of coercion does, namely, using force to bring non-believers to the true faith. Although Judaism was, and in some ways still is, a proselytizing religion, its record on rejecting the use of force to convert the heathen is remarkable indeed. According to the Encyclopedia of the Jewish Religion, the forced conversion of the Edomites to Judaism by John Hyrcanus, 135–15 BCE, is the only such recorded case in history. No other Western monotheistic religion can make such a claim. In view of the long history of Judaism, this is an especially remarkable record of non-violence in the name of God. Perhaps it helps if God has no name. It helps, too, that Judaism is a non-universalistic religion. Its doctrines do not imply, much less proclaim, that it is the right religion for everyone. In contrast, a universalistic faith, let us keep in mind here that the root meaning of Catholic is universal, implies that it is good for everyone. Why is this distinction between the unlimited scope of what is Catholic and the limited scope of what is Jewish so important? Because, given the human propensity for domination and coercion, it is but a small step from asserting that X is true or good for everyone to insisting that everyone accept X as true or good by force if necessary. This formula has justified forcible religious conversions in the past and now justifies a broad spectrum of forcible psychiatric interventions. Although a monotheistic God's power is necessarily total and unlimited, an earthly ruler's is not, a distinction apparently never lost on the Jews. Hence, perhaps, their simultaneous worship of both a fearsome, all-powerful God and of a law that keeps him in his place. Perhaps nothing illustrates more dramatically the difference between the ideological character of Christianity and Judaism than the objects of devotion upon which their worshippers are expected to gaze with awe. Christians on the icons of divinity, Jews on the divine law. Consider what each of these stands for. The figure of the crucified Christ for the Son of God who died for all of mankind, the scroll for the law God gave to Moses for the Jews only. It is no accident, then, that the Christian embraces the use of force in the name of God, whereas the Jew eschews not only the use of such force, but the very use of God's name. Contrast this particularistic, exclusivist, elitist posture of the Jew and the psychoanalyst with the universalistic Catholic scientific posture of the Christian and the psychiatrist. Christians believe that their ideas about religion are true not only for themselves, but for everyone. Psychiatrists believe that their ideas about psychopathology and psychotherapy are true not only for themselves, but for everyone. The former attitude, as we know all too well, led to the forcible spread of the Christian faith and to the glorifications of this practice. The latter attitude, though it is now generally denied, especially by psychiatrists, led to the psychiatric campaigns of forcibly imposing mental healing on unwilling subjects. Because the goods represented by Christian salvation and psychiatric cure have been considered superior to all others, their adherents have felt justified in suspending whatever value they reposed in the principle of limited power or the rule of law. To spread the benefits of Christianity and of psychiatry, no laws or limits need be observed. The end is so lofty that it justifies any means. How else can we account for Christians killing heretics with the love of Jesus on their lips? How else can we account for psychiatrists imprisoning mental patients with the love of mental health on their lips? The patriarchal premise. How is it that over long stretches of history, and in some parts of the world even today, religious ideas have justified the most absolute, unlimited uses of power? Although the details of the theological justifications of repression are numerous and complicated, they all come down to a single, rather simple image, namely to a monotheistic, male God who rules from heaven over all mankind as a father on earth rules over his children. The would-be Jew, Louis Finkelstein emphasizes, must demonstrate that his desire is based on no mundane motive. Similarly, the would-be psychoanalytic patient must demonstrate that he is a fit subject for analysis. Obviously, my foregoing analysis applies only to the Western monotheistic tradition. For example, the Hindu philosopher Radhakrishan emphasizes, Hinduism does not support the sophism that is often alleged that to coerce a man to have the right view is as legitimate as to save one by violence from committing suicide in a fit of delirium. The worshippers of the one jealous God are egged on to aggressive wars against people of alien cults. The spirit of old Israel is inherited by Christianity and Islam. A classic exposition of this religious perspective on power is Sir Robert Filmer's treatise tellingly titled Patriarcha. Written in 1640, this work, with the arresting subtitle, A Defense of the Natural Power of Kings Against the Unnatural Liberty of the People, was made famous by John Locke's satirical attack on it. Locke ridiculed the author for trying to provide chains for all mankind, which Filmer in fact did quite well. But what should interest us, and perhaps should have interested Locke a bit more also, was how Filmer justified the benefits, one might now say cures, which redounded to those enlightened enough to fasten those chains on themselves or others. What Filmer provided in his book was nothing novel, but was nevertheless very important, namely a patriarchal and specifically Judeo-Christian justification of political authority. Filmer maintained that kings were entitled to absolute power over their subjects, who in turn owed their rulers absolute obedience. Why? Because both the king's wielding of power and the subjects yielding to it were decreed by God, the divine lawgiver. How did Filmer know this? The Bible told him so. Until God created Adam, God himself ruled. With Adam, God created a paternal authority to rule in his place. This argument, writes Gordon Szasz, implied that government and monarchy in particular was a natural institution and that the burden of proof was on anyone who claimed that there were justifiable, enforceable limits to political authority. A number of concepts and images come together here, such as patriarchalism, paternalism, the divine rule of kings or other sovereigns, absolutism, slavery, and last but not least, revealed religion, in particular Judaism and Christianity. What characterizes all of these is that each sees the political order as naturally hierarchical, familial. On the one side is the father or lord or God, or his vicar on earth, king or pope. On the other side are the people seen as children, or slaves, or sinners, or a flock tended by a shepherd. Within such an image, Szasz reminds us, childhood was not something that was eventually outgrown, rather it was enlarged to include the whole of one's life. It might be unseemly and unnecessary to belabor that this is the basic image of what life is and ought to be, of how power ought to be distributed in society, that informs the Jewish and Christian worldviews. God is our Father in heaven. The priest is called Father. We are his children. Just a metaphor, you might say, but a master metaphor that continues to pack a powerful wallop of real, literal power. The fact is that for millennia, there were no individuals. As Sir Henry Maine observed, ancient law knows next to nothing of individuals. It is concerned not with individuals, but with families, not with single human beings, but groups. The case against the religious justification of coercion. Clearly, our rhetoric justifying the use of power not only reinforces our image of it, but also ultimately determines how, or whether, we try to limit it. Thus, if God is seen as all-powerful, demanding total submission to his will, and if power is wielded in the name of such a God, then not only will the wielders of power demand total submission, but those subject to authority and sharing its claim to legitimacy will also be eager to totally submit to it. To be sure, they may chafe under the yoke, but their complaints, couched in terms of misrule, will not challenge the principles legitimizing their own submission. Similar considerations apply to psychiatry and mental health as legitimizing images and principles. It is important to emphasize, in this connection, that the great historical struggles for religious liberty in Europe and especially in America antedate the modern struggles for national independence. More than 100 years before Jefferson and Madison successfully slayed clerical power in the New World, Thomas Hobbes stated the case for doing so in the Old, in terms as memorable as though less well remembered than those of the Founding Fathers. Again, he wrote in Leviathan, "The office of Christ's ministers in this world is to make men believe and have faith in Christ. But faith has no relation to, nor dependence at all upon compulsion or commandment. Therefore the ministers of Christ in this world have no power, by that title, to punish any man for not believing or for contradicting what they say." Sadly, but not surprisingly, liberation from oppression by the priest led, in most cases, to oppression by the politician, the interests of the state replacing the interests of God as the leading symbol for sanctioning power. I shall not be concerned here with this tragic but perhaps often inevitable metamorphosis in the grand human drama of domination and submission. Instead, I want to comment briefly on the specifically American historical experience vis-a-vis the problem of religious oppression and religious liberty. Isaiah Berlin's observation on this theme is pertinent in this connection. Whatever his crudities and errors, on the central issue Hobbes, not Locke, turned out to be right. Men sought neither happiness nor liberty nor justice, but, above and before all, security. Aristotle, too, was right. A great number of men were slaves by nature, and when liberated from their chains did not possess the moral and intellectual resources with which to face the prospect of responsibility, of too wide a choice between alternatives, and therefore, having lost one set of chains, inevitably searched for another or forged new chains themselves. Leaning heavily on the great thinkers of the European Enlightenment, the leaders of the American Enlightenment saw their task clearly. Simply put, it was this. For centuries, the soil of Europe was bathed in bloodshed in the name of God. Catholics persecuted Protestants, Protestants persecuted Catholics, and both persecuted the Jews. For men who worshipped liberty as well as a loving God, it was not a pretty sight to behold. Because in these persecutions, the use of force was justified by appeals to gods and churches, and because the actual use of force, making the persecutions possible, rested on an alliance between priest and king, the mechanism for controlling this sort of violence seemed obvious enough: separate church and state, spiritual authority, and secular power. The great writings of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison are sharply focused on this one theme: taming the abuse of power justified by faith. Their words are as true and timely today as ever. "It is error alone," wrote Jefferson, "which needs the support of government. Truth can stand by itself. The way to silence religious disputes is to take no notice of them. It does me no injury for my neighbor to say there are 20 gods or no God. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. Constraint may fix him obstinately in his errors, but will not cure them." Madison was equally firm in repudiating clerical coercion. In 1785, then only 24 years old, he wrote, We hold it for a fundamental and undeniable truth that the religion then of every man must be left to the conviction and conscience of every man. Who does not see that the same authority which can establish Christianity in exclusion of all other religions may establish with the same ease any particular sect of Christians in exclusion of all other sects? For Jefferson and Madison and their spiritual friends and allies, religious freedom, that is, freedom from constraint or coercion of any kind enforced in the name of God, was the crux of the struggle for personal and political freedom in general. This fact is familiar enough to historians and educated persons generally. What one think is less familiar is that Jefferson and Madison also clearly recognized that so long as a people want to submit themselves to a higher authority, whether it be pope or king, church or crown, their struggle for freedom is doomed to failure by their own refusal to accept the indivisibility of rights and responsibilities across as many areas of human concern as possible. So inspired, the founders of American freedom did two historically monumental things. First, they undermined and destroyed the idea of God as a morally legitimate sanction for the use of force, enshrining this bold proposition in the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. Second, they foresaw the danger to liberty that lurks in the nation-state itself and sought to fashion protections against it, enshrining this bold vision in a constitution explicitly limiting political power. In short, the Founding Fathers rejected the religious legitimization of unlimited power by appeals to an approving deity, embracing instead the prudential principle that since, unlike God, government cannot be perfect, its power must be limited. The psychiatric justification of coercion. For millennia, men viewed theological arguments as valid, indeed lofty, justifications for coercion. Indeed, many people still share that vision. We call them religious fanatics, a diagnosis that makes us feel smug and superior to them. But shouldn't we judge ourselves by analogous criteria? That is, by asking, what sorts of reasoning and argument do we accept as so true, irrefutable, and lofty that its conclusions justify coercion? The answer is painfully obvious. Do we not now seek truth in nature and science, much as our forebears did in God and His will? Do we not now believe in mental illness and psychiatric treatment, much as our forebears did in diabolical possession and exorcism? But our beliefs are true, and theirs were false, might be the reader's instinctive reaction. Perhaps so. That is not the point. The point is that we use our truth to justify our coercions. We use mental illness and psychiatric treatment as justification for pushing people around, just as our faith-intoxicated forebears used possession and dispossession to do so. It is important to re-emphasize in this connection that psychiatry, as we now know it, began with the practice of confining mad persons in insane asylums, a practice that, of course, needed to be justified. What justified it was the nascent idea, unknown before, say, 1600, that madness is unreason, and that unreason can, in the asylum, be turned back into reason, and hence sanity. The prospect of sanity tomorrow thus justified coercion and incarceration today. In the course of the next 3 centuries, justifying coercion by therapy became as dear to the heart of modern secular man as justifying coercion by theology ever was to the heart of medieval man. The parallel is indeed arresting. In the one case, man, perpetually at risk as a sinner, is invited to rivet his gaze on a dreadful future in hell or on a blissful one in heaven and conduct himself accordingly. And if he does not, this vision of the future justifies his brothers, who are his keepers, to save him from perdition and put him on the road to salvation, whether he likes it or not. In the other case, man, perpetually at risk as mentally ill, is invited to rivet his gaze on a dreadful future in mental sickness or on a blissful one in mental health, and conduct himself accordingly. And if he does not, this vision of the future justifies his brothers, who are his keepers, to save him from mental illness and put him on the road to mental health, whether he likes it or not. Thus, the modern ideologist, in particular the communist and the psychiatrist, has wrenched the torch that lets him see the future ever so clearly from the fist of the religious zealot and holds it high himself. The eagerness with which the modern benefactors of mankind are willing to degrade, persecute, and slaughter millions of particular men, women, and children today in order to make life better for mankind in general tomorrow has been remarked on by many observers of our age. For example, C.S. Lewis noted wryly, "The general movement of our time seeks to fix men's attentions on the future. Gratitude looks to the past and love to the present. Fear, avarice, lust, and ambition look ahead. We, Screwtape Speaking, want the whole race perpetually in pursuit of the rainbow's end, never honest, nor kind, nor happy now." Indeed, Lewis warned that this ideological passion now fuels a specifically medical therapeutic justification for tyranny. The new Nero will approach us with the silky manners of a doctor. Even if the treatment is painful, even if it is lifelong, even if it is fatal, that will be only a regrettable accident. The intention was purely therapeutic. Although Lewis was not describing the psychiatric ideologue, he might just as well have been. It is obvious that people now resort to the rhetoric of mental illness and mental treatment in countless situations and ways, but always for the same end: to justify manipulating, intimidating, incriminating, excusing, but always coercing individuals today because they are mentally ill, and thus by protecting and promoting their mental health, ensuring their liberty and happiness tomorrow. For a remarkable 19th century illustration of this imagery, I offer the following true story. Slavery as Ticklatric Treatment. In May 1851, Samuel A. Cartwright, M.D., a prominent Louisiana physician, published an essay entitled "Report on the Diseases and Physical Peculiarities of the Negro Race" in the then prestigious New Orleans Medical and Surgical Journal. Cartwright claimed to have discovered 2 new diseases peculiar to Negroes, which he believed justified their enslavement as a therapeutic necessity for the slaves and as a medical responsibility for the masters. Here is a preface of the argument in Cartwright's own words. Draptomanla, or the disease causing slaves to run away. Drapetomia is from drapetes, a runaway slave, and mania, mad or crazy. It is unknown to our medical authorities, although its diagnostic symptom, the absconding from service, is well known to our planters and overseers. In noticing a disease not heretofore classed among the long list of maladies that man is subject to, it was necessary to have a new term to express it. The cause, in the most of cases, that induces the Negro to run away from service is as much a disease of the mind as any other species of mental alienation, and much more curable as a general rule. With the advantages of proper medical advice strictly followed, this troublesome practice that many Negroes have of running away can be almost entirely prevented, although the slaves be located on the borders of a free state, within a stone's throw of the abolitionists. Possessthesla Ethiopis, or hebitude of mind, a disease peculiar to Negroes. Dysesthesia, Ethiopis, is a disease peculiar to Negroes, affecting both mind and body, in a manner as well expressed by dysesthesia, the name I have given it, as could be by a single term. It differs from every other species of mental disease, as it is accompanied with physical signs or lesions of the body, discoverable to the medical observer, which are always present and sufficient to account for the symptoms. The complaint is easily curable if treated on sound physiological principles. The skin is dry, thick, and harsh to the touch, and the liver inactive. The liver, skin, and kidneys should be stimulated to activity and be made to assist in decarbonizing the blood. The best means is to put the patient to some hard kind of work in the open air and sunshine that will compel him to expand his lungs, as chopping wood, splitting rails, or sawing with the cross-cut or whip-saw. Any kind of labor will do that will cause full and free respiration in its performance, as lifting or carrying heavy weights, the object being to expand the lungs by full and deep inspirations and expirations, thereby to vitalize the impure circulating blood by introducing oxygen and expelling carbon. The compulsory power of the white man, by making the slothful Negro take active exercise, puts into active play the lungs, through whose agency the vitalized blood is sent to the brain to give liberty to the mind, emphasis added. The justificatory rhetoric of psychiatry is here displayed in full panoply. Mental diseases, physical causes, bodily lesions, and, mirabile dictu, effective treatments with bountiful benefits for patient and society alike. While the report speaks for itself, I want to underscore some of its features since the same elements continue to characterize contemporary psychiatric claims concerning mental diseases and psychiatric treatments. 1. Although running away or escaping from captivity is ordinarily thought of as a deliberate human act, Cartwright refers to it as an occurrence caused by certain antecedent events. Drapetomania causes slaves to run away. The cause, moreover, is a disease of the mind. 2. To prevent the full-blown development of drapetomania exhibited by the actual running away of the slave, whipping is recommended as medical therapy. In a revealing allusion to its historical origins, the treatment is called whipping the devil out of them. 3. The cure of drapetomania and the restoration of the slave to sanity requires that the patients be treated like children, with care, kindness, attention, and humanity to prevent and cure them from running away. 4. As with drapetomania, Cartwright identifies dysesthesia Ethiopis specifically as a mental disease, accompanied with physical signs or lesions of the body discoverable to the medical observer. 5. Although Cartwright mentions not a single free Negro who has consulted him as a patient for this illness, he refers to the complaint as it prevails among free Negroes. 6. Nearly all free Negroes that have not got some white person to direct and to take care of them are said to be afflicted with dysesthesia Ethiopis. For Cartwright, this alleged correlation was further evidence that for the black man, sanity was to be subjected as slave to the white man, and for the white man, sanity was to dominate as master, the black man. Today, similar evidence makes us conclude that for the mentally ill, sanity, rationality, is to submit as a patient to the psychiatrist, and that for the psychiatrist, sanity, responsibility, is to dominate as a therapist, the mental patient. No wonder psychiatrists ignore their own history. Remembering it surely would make it more difficult to generate enthusiasm for DSM-3 or indignation over the conduct of psychiatrists in the Soviet Union. Paraphrasing Hegel, Shaw observed, "We learn from history that we learn nothing from history." Perhaps they were right. Deviance and control, religion and psychiatry. We are ready now to draw some parallels between religion and psychiatry by focusing on the ideas and acts most abhorred by each of these systems of belief and social control. The core act of deviance in religion is blasphemy or heresy. In psychiatry, it is delusion or psychosis. To appreciate the similarities between blasphemy and psychosis, we must first consider the idea of freedom of speech. Commentators on First Amendment freedoms often cite one of Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes' striking phrases to illustrate what this principle ought to mean. The principle of the Constitution that most imperatively calls for our attachment, said Holmes, is not free thought for those who agree with us, but freedom for the thought that we hate. Here, then, is a short list of some of the typical utterances that people have always hated and still do today, and for which those who uttered them were denounced in the past as blasphemers and are diagnosed now as psychotics. Jesus is the Son of Man, not of God. I should kill myself. My life is worthless. The government is violating my human rights. The person who uttered the first statement was considered to be a blasphemer in medieval Catholic counties because he was said to deny the divinity of Jesus. The person who utters the second and third statements is considered to be psychotic in the United States or USR because he is said to deny reality, namely that life is good and that the state is good. Because in the United States, life is good, the person who wants to leave it by suicide is, in America, ipso facto crazy. Because the Soviet state is good, the person who wants to leave it by emigration is, in Russia, ipso facto crazy. The fact that everyone knows there is nothing crazy about either decision only supports the legitimacy of the authorities' use of coercion. When moral legitimacy draws its support from the masses longing to be a happy herd, hypocrisy is a source of strength, not weakness. The following are two more examples. The consecrated bread and wine of the Eucharist are the body and blood of Jesus. My wife is putting poison in my food and making me impotent. The person who uttered the first statement was considered to be a heretic by certain Protestants. The person who utters the second statement is considered to be a psychotic by psychiatrists. It is false and foolish to try to dismiss such cases as instances of religious or psychiatric abuse. On the contrary, they are typical examples of religious and psychiatric persecution, justified by blasphemy against the sacred beliefs of religious and psychiatric authorities, and made possible by people's blind adherence to the belief that such deviance amply justifies controlling the deviants. This persecutory position may be best appreciated by contrasting it with the position explicitly rejecting the use of force for the expression of opinion, as exemplified in one of Thomas Jefferson's letters to his grandson, written in 1808. When I hear another express an opinion which is not mine, I say to myself, he has a right to his opinion, as I to mine. Why should I question it? His error does me no injury, and shall I become a Don Quixote to bring all men by force of argument to one opinion? If a fact be misstated, it is probable that he is gratified by a belief of it, and I have no right to deprive him of the gratification. If he wants information, he will ask it, and then I will give it in measured terms. But if he still believes his own story and shows a desire to dispute the facts with me, I hear him and say nothing. It is his affair, not mine, if he prefers error. Consider in this connection that but 1 century before Jefferson, only a little more than 300 years ago, in 1648 to be exact, the Parliament of England enacted an ordinance for the punishing of blasphemies and heresies, the punishment in each instance being death. What were the acts to be punished? They were such things as asserting that there is no God, that the Son is not God, or that the Holy Ghost is not God, or that Christ is not God equal with the Father, or that the Holy Scripture is not the Word of God, or that the bodies of men shall not rise again after they are dead. Some of these utterances are, of course, still offensive to many people. Suffice it to add here that the long history of persecution for blasphemy was based on the biblical injunction, "You shall not revile God," Exodus 22:28. Since the writers of Exodus did not say which God, this phrase was equally useful for Catholics and Protestants. Jefferson, who did not mince words when it came to denouncing religious bigotry, spoke contemptuously of the incomprehensible jargon of the Trinitarian arithmetic, that 3 are 1 and 1 is 3. Enough, then, of religious blasphemies, that is, of the thoughts that the devoutly religious hate. What about psychiatric blasphemies, the thoughts that the devoutly rational hate? Psychiatrists have long had their index of prohibited behaviors, called psychiatric diagnoses. In 1982, the American Psychiatric Association published its current catalog of blasphemies punishable with involuntarily imposed or otherwise unwanted psychiatric interventions, and a broad range of other social sanctions, especially when associated with the additional offense of dangerousness to self or others. A few examples of these offenses must suffice here. Elective mutism, a blasphemy usually displayed by children, manifested by continuous refusal to speak in almost all situations, including at school. Anorexia nervosa, manifested by an intense fear of becoming obese and refusal to maintain minimal body weight. Tobacco dependence, a blasphemy we are warned that is obviously widespread. Pathological gambling. Uneducated persons may confuse this with bad luck or losing, just as they may confuse kleptomania with theft. Transsexualism, manifested by a persistent wish to be rid of one's genitals and to live as a member of the other sex. Atypical gender identity disorders, or paraphilias, manifested by the subject's reports of unusual or bizarre imagery or acts necessary for sexual excitement. These psychiatric blasphemies are especially odious because frequently these individuals assert that the behavior causes them no distress and that their only problem is the reaction of others to their behavior. Why do we need this master list of contemporary blasphemies and heresies? The compilers of DSM-3 are eager to tell us. We need it to help the sinners repent. Making a DSM-3 diagnosis represents an initial step in a comprehensive evaluation leading to the formulation of a treatment plan. There are 3 important ideas implicit in this smug claim. First, that every disorder classified by the compilers is a bona fide illness. Second, that every such illness is remediable by means of a bona fide treatment. And third, that the treatment to be applied to the blasphemer ought to be chosen by the psychiatrist, not the patient. But surely, if a man has a right to declare that there are 3 gods, or 13, or that there is no God, then he must also have the right to declare that he has 3 personalities, or 13, or that he belongs in the body of a person of the opposite sex, or that he is God, or any other idea that we may deem to be true or false, religion or heresy, reality or delusion. But we cannot simply leave it at that. We know that human beings rarely form even small groups, much less large, complex societies, without resorting to the use of some force. Thus, the practical question before us comes down to choosing those uses of force we approve and rejecting those we disapprove. For the reasons I have stated, I reject the psychiatric use of force. On the other hand, for those who believe that mental health is more important than freedom, coerced psychiatric practices will be justified by their therapeutic rationale, just as for those who believe that redemption is more important than freedom, coerced religious practices are justified by their theological rationale. On guarding the guardians. Unfortunately, Dostoevsky was only half right when he observed that if there is no God, everything is permitted. As all history shows, everything is permitted even if there is a God, since the perpetrators of evil have never failed to secure his blessings. The human condition is precarious indeed. Because it is our fate not only to act, but also to have to account for our actions, to ourselves as well as to others, we have an imperative need to justify our behavior. To satisfy it, mankind has evolved a short but apparently serviceable shopping list of standardized justificatory images and slogans: God, patriotism, compassion, and of course, science and treatment. The havoc wreaked by men and women heaven sent, or therapy bent on helping others, especially those who want nothing to do with them, is banal. I mention it only because the notion of psychiatric help is such a widely accepted justification for coercion today, especially in the United States. What lessons, then, can the history of power, justified by the absolute authority of God, teach us about the problems of power justified by the absolute authority of science, or pseudoscience? The Reformation was fueled in large part by the dissatisfactions of Catholics, some of them priests, with the abuses of the then prevailing religious practices. Protestantism is thus intimately connected with the development of fresh ideas about both limited government and religious freedom. The battle over blasphemy now entered a new phase. Some of Martin Luther's views are especially pertinent in this connection. Early in his career as a critic of clerical abuses, Luther advocated complete religious liberty, in effect, a separation of church and state. Every man, he wrote in 1523, should be allowed to believe as he will and can, and no one should be constrained for religion. He was fierce in his opposition to the Inquisition, declaring that one could not be a Catholic without being a murderer, adding proudly that we do not kill, banish, or persecute anybody who teaches other than we do. We fight with the word of God alone. However, as Luther's power grew, he changed his tune, ending his life urging that Jewish synagogues and prayer books be burned, that rabbis be forbidden to teach, and that the Jews be forcibly converted to Christianity. He also insisted that the Catholic Mass was blasphemous and urged its suppression by the government. Interestingly, a number of elements in the Protestant-Catholic relationship, and especially in Luther's criticisms of the Roman Church, have re-emerged, in different terms, in the relationship between contemporary critics of psychiatry and conventional psychiatrists. To begin with, there were 2 distinct aspects to the Reformation protest against Catholicism. One had to do with the nature of God. Was he a single God or a trinity? The other had to do with the power of the Church. Should religious deviance be punished by means of secular power, or should religious differences be tolerated? The original Protestant position on the first question was to reaffirm the monotheistic definition of God given in the Old Testament. This is how, in the 16th century, the term anti-Trinitarian came to be applied to some Protestants. Protestants might have responded by asserting that they were not anti-Trinitarians but only Unitarians, that is, monotheists. Because I don't accept the expanded multitarian definition of disease, I have been accused of denying the reality of mental illness and called an ant-psychiatrist. Actually, like the Protestants who re-embraced the strict Unitarian monotheistic definition of God, I have simply re-emphasized the strict Unitarian materialistic definition of disease. It is important to note in this connection that people did not find it very interesting that the Jews had always rejected the doctrine of the Trinity. But people began to find it very interesting indeed when Christians, even Catholic priests, began to reject this idea and re-embraced an earlier and stricter definition of a non-Trinitarian deity. It is no secret that most physicians, that is, real doctors, not psychiatrists, have always maintained and still maintain that mental patients are not really ill, that mental illnesses are not real illnesses, and that psychiatrists are not real doctors. To be sure, real doctors say such things only derisively, in jest. Still, much of what I have written about mental illness and psychiatry is similar to what, say, surgeons have long maintained. But when I, a professor of psychiatry in a medical school, reject the idea that there exist illnesses of the mind or psyche, not to mention the terrible mental illnesses that affect whole nations, societies, cultures, or mankind itself, and re-emphasize the definition of disease as a bodily material phenomenon, people find it very interesting indeed. In short, my claim that mental illness is an oxymoronic fiction is similar to the claim that a monotheistic Trinitarian God is an oxymoronic fiction. The second parallel between the anti-Trinitarians and my criticism of psychiatry is equally striking. What animated the critics and criticisms of the early Protestants? The fraud and force, the deceptions and coercions that had come to pervade the practices of the Catholic clergy and the Roman Church. In other words, the Protestants, the name is important, protested against two things: indulgences and the Inquisition. The former symbolized fraud, the latter symbolized persecution, both practiced, of course, in the name of God. The Reformers insisted that buying indulgences does not ensure salvation and that the Word of God cannot and must not be spread by force. What has animated me in my criticisms of psychiatry? The fraud and force, the deceptions and coercions that pervade psychiatric practices. I insist that a decent and honorable life cannot be achieved by buying or otherwise receiving psychiatric treatments, because problems in living are not diseases that can be cured, whether by drugs, electricity, or any other treatment for mental illness. And I maintain that involuntary psychiatric interventions are not cures, but coercions, and urge that psychiatrists reject such methods. However, although one condemn the therapeutic rape of the patient by the psychiatrist, I defend the legitimacy of psychiatric practices between consenting adults, not because psychiatric help or psychotherapy is necessarily beneficial for its recipient, though it may be, but because infringing on people's freedom to give or receive such help, like infringing on the freedom to give or receive religious help, constitutes a crass violation of inalienable human rights. These parallels between religion and psychiatry, between the use of fraud and force in the name of God and in the name of mental health, bring us full circle to the problem of unlimited power and the mechanism for limiting it. The unlimited power of the Church rested on two pillars. God, the grand legitimizer, spiritually justified the use of any means in his name, and the state, the ultimate repository of power, actually possessed the means for controlling deviance. When these two forces were allied, the result was total power wielded irresistibly by a totalitarian system. Similar considerations obtain for mental health, the grand legitimizer of our present age, and its alliance with the state. Thanks to this historical parallel, we need not invent a new mechanism for limiting the power of this new alliance between psychiatry and the state. Today, the psychiatrist is empowered not only to provide services to those who want them, but also to persecute, in the name of mental health, those who do not want them. Faced with this situation, we have three basic options. We can take away the psychiatrist's power to incarcerate the innocent or exculpate the guilty. We can take away his tools, lobotomy, electroshock, or neuroleptic drugs, or we can leave things as they are. Taking away the psychiatrist's power would be like the Founding Fathers abolishing priestly power. Psychiatric help, like religious help, could be given to anyone who wants it, but it would no longer justify the use of force. Taking away the psychiatrist's tools would be like the communists abolishing various religious practices. People would be protected from psychiatric abuses as defined by the state, albeit paternalistically, by being treated like children who need the state's protection from their wicked exploiters and their weak selves. Leaving things as they are would be like continuing to support a status quo of forcing help on people in the name of God. We would continue to prattle about the rights of mental patients as if heretics could have rights in a theocratic society, and we would congratulate ourselves on our humanitarian laws guaranteeing the mental patient's right to treatment, as if inquisitors had ever wanted to deprive heretics of their right to worship the God of their persecutors. Indeed, Jefferson never tired of trying to separate the priest from his power, an effort that was then widely interpreted as hostility to religion itself. In a letter to John Adams, written on June 15, 1813, Jefferson refers to an earlier communication on the subject of religion, which, by its publication, will gratify the priesthood with new occasion of repeating their comminations against me. They wish it to be believed that he can have no religion who advocates its freedom. This is precisely the position of organized psychiatry today, vis-a-vis the handful of psychiatrists who eschew coercion. To paraphrase Jefferson, the psychiatrists wish it to be believed that he can have no psychiatry who advocates its freedom. I think the psychiatrists are right, and that Jefferson protested too much. When the United States was in its infancy, the clergy throughout the world were so closely allied with coercion that the two were, for all practical purposes, inseparable. The same is now true for psychiatry. Without coercion, psychiatry would be so unlike what we now call psychiatry that my colleagues are right in believing that by opposing psychiatric coercion, I oppose psychiatry itself. By separating church and state, religion was deprived of its power to abuse the individual, and the state was deprived of one of its major justifications for the use of force. The upshot was a quantum leap toward greater individual liberty such as the world had never seen. By separating psychiatry and the state, we would do the same for our age. At one fell swoop, psychiatry would be deprived of its power to abuse the individual, and the state would be deprived of one of its major justifications for the use of force. The result would be another major advance for individual liberty, or perhaps the advent of another system of justificatory rhetoric and persecutory practice, replacing both the religious and psychiatric systems. Psychiatric power reconsidered. Like the power of the priest in the past, so the power of the psychiatrist at present is a fact or social reality. We may look upon such a fact as a solution or as a problem. Obviously, so long as we view it as a solution, we try to perfect it, not to abolish it. On the other hand, as soon as we begin to view the use of power by a person as problematic, and if at the same time we also question the high-minded pretext with which he justifies his power, there is hope of our being able to limit or even abolish his power by questioning and perhaps successfully undermining his justification for using it. Acting as the agents of the dominant social institution, men always claim to be using force to do good. The justificatory image and idiom for doing good thus typically covers both consensual and coerced actions. Therein lies a gigantic logical error and ethical mischief that we must expose and reject. In a free society, acts between consenting adults are permissible, in a sense good, because they betoken the freedom of the actors, not because the contents or consequences of the acts are necessarily beneficial. We can sell cars, vacations, and stocks, regardless of whether buying them benefits the purchaser. Nor do benefits justify coercion. You cannot force a person to buy stocks or bonds, even if you can prove that he will make a profit on the purchase. The psychiatric premise. The logic and ethics of psychiatric paternalism entail altogether different premises, rules, and standards. Thus, in his dealings with the voluntary patient, the psychiatrist typically de-emphasizes the issue of whether his client wants, or has a good reason for wanting, his services, dwelling instead on the beneficial effects of the therapy. Similarly, in his dealings with the involuntary patient, the psychiatrist justifies his coercions, especially nowadays, by insisting on the therapeutic, indeed, life-saving powers of his practices. This perspective has been dubbed the thank you theory on the ground that the recovered mental patient's gratitude for getting involuntary electroshock or neuroleptics is adequate justification for psychiatric coercions. The result is the psychiatrist's passionately held conviction that what justifies psychiatric interventions, voluntary or involuntary, is not consent, but the presence of mental illness and the promise of its cure. No matter what the law does, we'll always treat all the patients we want, declares Lauren Roth, a professor of psychiatry at the University of Pittsburgh and a leading authority on psychiatry and the law. By patients, Roth, of course, does not mean persons who would like to avail themselves of a treatment they cannot afford. He means persons who look to the law to protect them from psychiatric coercion justified as treatment. The point is that psychiatrists love to be despots, and like all despots, revel in being both coercive and compassionate, oppressive and merciful. Because of the reasons reviewed above, I believe that our efforts to bring about psychiatric reforms in the past have been, and our preoccupation with psychiatric abuses, especially in other countries, today are, completely misconceived and misdirected. We stubbornly combine and confuse two different problems and questions. One is, what are the proper or improper uses of psychiatry? The other is, should psychiatric practice be based on the principle of coercive paternalism or on the principle of free contract? Or should there perhaps be, as I have suggested many years ago, two radically different and distinct kinds of psychiatry, one based on coercion and another on contract? Psychiatrists who like to debate the problem of psychiatric abuses, especially American psychiatrists who glory in righteously condemning Soviet psychiatrists, are, without exception, psychiatric paternalists. The premise behind their posture is that if psychiatry is practiced properly, that is, if it is not politically abused, then psychiatric paternalism is a valid guiding principle for the profession, and there is no need to limit the powers of psychiatrists. But this is a tragically false and futile position. To begin with, it is impossible to know or establish in a morally and politically unbiased way what is or is not psychiatric abuse. As all history teaches us, oppressors tend to view their use of power as good, whereas the oppressed tend to view their coerced conditions as bad. Thus, American psychiatrists calling Russian psychiatric practices abuses is but a feeble and ironic echo of American mental patients calling psychiatric practices in the United States abuses. In addition, we know, as Lord Acton emphasized, that power tends to corrupt, and that absolute power tends to corrupt even more. We also know, as Thomas Jefferson pointed out, that if men were angels, there would be no need for limited government, or for any kind of government. My point is that the currently fashionable effort to combat psychiatric abuses is either a stupid and misdirected enterprise or a ploy to preserve unlimited psychiatric power, or both. The only way to limit psychiatric abuses is by limiting psychiatric power. And that puts the problem of psychiatric power back where it squarely belongs, in the realm of religion, morals, and law, in a word, in the realm of politics. Losing liberty through psychiatry. Lest I seem obsessed with opposing coercion, whether justified on clerical or clinical grounds, I should like to say that I am no more obsessed with this theme than were the men who drafted the Virginia Statute for establishing religious freedom and the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. While George Washington would have been content to have all Christian churches equally established, Jefferson, Madison, and their allies wanted much more. The result was the passage in January 1786 of the Statute for Establishing Religious Freedom in Virginia, whose opening words are perhaps even more relevant to our present psychiatric situation than they were to the religious situation Americans faced 200 years ago. Well aware that Almighty God hath created the mind free, that all attempts to influence it by temporal punishments or burdens, or by civil incapacitations, tend only to beget habits of hypocrisy and meanness, and are a departure from the plans of the holy author of our religion, who being Lord both of body and mind, yet chose not to propagate it by coercion on either, as was his almighty power to do, emphasis added. Surely this is a remarkable rejection of nearly 1,500 years of persecution carried out in the name of the Christian God. Viewed against this backdrop, then, is it not a spiritual regression for us to embrace coercion in the name of our modern, secular God mental health? Although these reflections might seem far-ranging, They basically come down to reinforcing the old adage that the pen is mightier than the sword. After all, power is force that people wield over other people. Since those who wield power are always fewer in number than those over whom power is wielded, no person could rule, much less govern, without his power being credibly legitimized by certain ideas. It is these ideas that sanction some to use power and require others to submit to it. In the end, the whole structure of power, religious, political, psychiatric, rests on certain ideas packaged in the master metaphors of our language. As psychiatrists, psychologists, and professionals in the allied disciplines, it behooves us then to scrutinize our own ideas, particularly the idea of mental illness, which we must judge, of course, by its uses and consequences. I, for one, find it wanting, not only as a conceptual aid, but most importantly, as a justification for violence against those who act or think differently than we do. Ideas, as Richard Weaver never tired of emphasizing, are important because they have consequences. If the consequences are powerful, as they sometimes are, then the ideas that generate them are also powerful. The divine right of kings was such an idea. It justified the absolute rule of monarchs. The subhumanity of the Negro was such an idea. It justified American slavery. Mental illness is such an idea. It justifies institutional psychiatry. Moreover, if we accept that, because they know God's will, priests are justified in coercing sinners, we can expect that the contours of their coercions will vary, but their justifications will have no trouble keeping pace with their practices. The same goes for our accepting that, because they are experts on mental illness, psychiatrists are justified in coercing the mentally sick. My own experience as a psychiatrist bears this out. When I was a young psychiatrist, psychotics were hospitalized for a long time, often for life. Psychiatrists then claimed they always hospitalized mental patients for exactly the right length of time, but most people believed the patients were confined too long. Now that I am an old psychiatrist, psychotics are hospitalized for a short time, often only a few days. Psychiatrists still claim they always hospitalize mental patients for exactly the right length of time, but most people now believe the patients are confined too briefly. The rationalizations for the duration of the confinement have kept pace with these changes. 4 decades ago, psychotics were considered to be chronically ill and dangerous. Since their illness was not considered to be responsive to specific treatment, protracted custodial care was regarded as the most humane and scientific method of treating them. Now psychotics are considered to have acute episodes and to be non-dangerous. Since their illness is considered to be responsive to specific pharmacological treatment, brief periods of hospitalization combined with intensive chemotherapy are regarded as the most humane and scientific method for treating them. These are all fables, of course. The will to believe in mental illness and the need to do something ostensibly for, but in fact to, mental patients forms an irresistible mixture of justifications and motives that, in our age of madness, can make virtually any mental health policy seem both humane and scientific. Chapter 11. Mental Illness as Legal Fiction. We know insanity is a mysterious disease, that it may exist without physical indications, is often cunningly concealed so as almost altogether to baffle detection, even by a specialist, or may be so occult as to cause the most eminent alienists to clash as to its existence in an instance. Warner v. Packer, 1910. Because the idea of insanity, unlike the idea of illness, originates from a legal or quasi-legal context, it is impossible to understand it without paying proper attention to this context. My aim in this chapter is to examine a specific legal aspect of insanity, namely, its role as a legal fiction. According to Black's Law Dictionary, 4th ed., a legal fiction is an assumption or supposition of law that something which is or may be false is true, or that a state of facts exists which has never really taken place. A rule of law which assumes as true and will not allow to be disproved something which is false but not impossible. In the American historical legal experience, the classic example of a legal fiction is the status of the Negro slave as part person or property. No less lofty a legal document than the Constitution of the United States defines enslaved blacks this way. The institution of American chattel slavery rested, as I shall discuss in a moment, on the legal fiction that slaves were not persons but personality, that is, possessions or chattel. The idea that some individuals who seem to be adult men and women with appropriate rights and responsibilities are in law, de jure, and hence also in fact de facto, not really persons because they are insane, is, in my opinion, also a legal fiction. I would venture to say that just as the view of the Negro slave as property was the grand American racial legal fiction before the Civil War, so the view of the disturbed and disturbing person as mentally ill has been the grand American medical legal fiction since then. Indeed, the idea of insanity illustrated in the opinion in Warner v. Packer, cited as the epigraph at the beginning of this chapter, is as apt an illustration of this Santa Claus function of insanity as one could wish for. A fiction is an untruth we believe to be the truth because we want to believe it. No one denies that this phenomenon exists, especially among children. No one denies that it exists among adults too, especially among those professing a religion different from ours. No one denies that it exists even among scientists, especially if they support a theory whose validity one rejects. But the masses of people, especially the masses of modern intellectuals, reject the idea that their favorite facts may also be fictions. It has become too easy to see, warned Herbert J. Muller, that the luckless men of the past lived by mistaken, even absurd beliefs, so we may fail in a decent respect for them and forget that the historians of the future will point out that we too lived by myths. So the problem remains, how do we recognize our own fictional beliefs? The trouble is that this question is phrased incorrectly. The person who believes that his idea, which we may think is a fiction, is true, experiences his belief as a solution, not as a problem. In that sense, there is no problem. There is only the human intellect at work, showing ourselves and each other different images of the world around and within us. And there are only different religious and political and now also psychiatric systems, allowing us to pick the images we want and reject those we do not want. Insanity as a legal fiction. What does it mean to assert that we should try to understand a particular concept as a legal fiction? Lon L. Fuller, a distinguished legal scholar, offers this answer. To obtain an understanding of any particular legal fiction, we must first inquire, what premise does it assume? With what proposition is it seeking to reconcile the decision at hand? In most cases, the answer is easily discovered. Much of what I say in this book constitutes precisely such a functional analysis of the meanings and uses of mental illness. Of course, Fuller is right when he observes that the function of a legal fiction is easily discovered. What premise does it, mental illness, assume? It assumes that the idea of illness is applicable to the mind, or whatever we mean by the mind. With what proposition is it seeking to reconcile the decision at hand, psychiatric coercions and excuses? It seeks to reconcile the decision to deprive innocent persons of liberty and to exonerate guilty persons of responsibility, with the proposition that insanity is an illness which annuls free will and responsibility, and with the claim that so treating certain persons does not violate our commitment to a political philosophy of individual freedom and responsibility under the rule of law. Legal fiction as literalized metaphor. Legal authorities, no less than psychiatric ones, insist that mental illness is a fact, and more specifically, that it is a disease like any other. Mental disease is a medical problem, Edwin Keedy. Mental illnesses are the subject matter of medical science, Carter v. U.S. We do not insist on a legal formula in diagnosing other diseases. Why in this instance? How can insanity be a fiction when so many thoughtful and educated persons consider it to be a fact? The answer is simple. Observers of the human condition, even the most brilliant ones, have time and again missed or misunderstood the fundamentally metaphoric nature of language. For example, Thomas Hobbes, 1588-1679, defined words used metaphorically as employed to deceive others. Similarly, John Locke, 1632-1704, believed that the artificial and figurative application of words is for nothing else but to insinuate wrong ideas, move the passions, and thereby mislead the judgment. Such observations miss the point that language, in any of its forms, can be used equally easily and well to inform or misinform. Distinguishing truth from falsehood requires not purging our language of metaphors, but taming our passions to control and dominate others. In reality, the relationship between language and the passions is a reciprocal one, language inflaming and deforming the passions, and the passions inflaming and distorting language, both spoken and heard. Not surprisingly, the hostility exhibited by Hobbes and Locke towards metaphors reemerges in the attitudes of some philosophers and jurists towards legal fictions. Jeremy Bentham, 1748-1832, reviled legal fiction as a syphilis which runs in every vein of English law and carries into every part of the system the principle of rottenness. Standing as they did at the threshold of the Enlightenment, we can forgive Locke, Hobbes, and Bentham for their positivistic protests against metaphors as mischief-making devices. Their tropophobia, however, is alive and well in the writings of modern positivistic legal philosophers, such as Felix S. Cohen, who calls legal concepts supernatural entities and fulminates against jurisprudence as a special branch of the science of transcendental nonsense. Cohen's view reflects the modern prejudice that anything that is not science is nonsense, and leads to the nonsense of classifying economics and psychology as positive sciences. On the other hand, already in the 18th century, William Blackstone, 1723 to 1780, recognized that the law cannot do without fictions, some of which may be highly beneficial and useful. At the same time, he was keenly aware of the strategic character of legal fictions, remarking that, while we may applaud the end, we cannot admire the means. Insanity as a legal fiction is precisely such an unadmirable means to an end many people now applaud, namely, caring for insane persons. That there are grave dangers in the pursuit of ostensibly noble ends with palpably ignoble means, I need not dwell on. Suffice it here to add that contemporary activists, lawyers, and judges, intent on promoting what I call therapy by the judiciary, have eagerly embraced as truths not only the fictions of the law, but the fictions of psychiatry as well. For them, expert opinions rendered in court by psychiatrists have the logical status of scientific facts and the moral force of divine commandments. Legal fiction as a mask. In his important work titled Persons and Masks of the Law, John T. Noonan, Jr. makes two very important points. One is that legal fictions are necessary for maintaining a social order based on a dominant ideology. The other is that such fictions often conflict with our intuitive sense of justice and thus generate dangerous divisions in society. Noonan starts with an observation about law that applies equally well to psychiatry. The definition of law, he writes, depends on the purpose of the definer. However, instead of acknowledging this premise, many of those who write about jurisprudential matters analyze rules abstractly, without reference to their aim, and argue about each other's definitions. The same situation prevails with respect to definitions of mental illness and other key psychiatric concepts. Thus, we have mental diseases like oppositional behavior, ego-dystonic homosexuality, and tobacco dependence, and arguments about whether these conditions should or should not be classified as mental diseases. While officially, the classifier's motives are concealed behind the absurd contention that psychiatric nosology is a collection of facts, in practice, those engaged in creating new mental diseases advance various reasons for their decisions. Some say that we ought to classify X, whatever the behavior may be, as an illness because only then can we conduct neurobiological research into its causes and cures. Others say that we should do so because the patients need treatment and cannot ask for it themselves. Still others say that we should do so because the victims cannot be held responsible for their criminal acts. Concealing the person behind rules and roles. Classifying persons as mental patients and creating legal fictions involving human beings lead to the same result. The person, concealed behind a mask, is rendered less than fully human or even completely non-human. Rules, observes Noonan, not persons, are the ordinary subject matter of legal study. Similarly, psychopathological processes, not troubled or troubling persons, are the subject matter of psychiatry. I have remarked earlier on how attaching a medical diagnosis to a person makes him, in his role as patient, similar to and exchangeable or fungible with other patients similarly diagnosed. See Chapter 4. The fungibility of the patient role is especially important in psychiatry because the persons we call mental patients have personal problems. Since the person as an individual is the very paradigm of the non-fungible, viewing him as a mental patient represents the profoundest possible change in perspective. Classified as depressives, phobics, and schizophrenics, mental patients are considered to be more alike than unlike. They can be counted as similar and treated similarly. Such similar treatment of similar things is, of course, a hallmark of scientific medicine, pitting psychiatry squarely against itself. Is psychiatry a medical enterprise concerned with treating diseases, or a humanistic enterprise concerned with helping persons with their personal problems? Psychiatry could be one or the other, but it cannot, despite the pretensions and protestations of psychiatrists, be both. It is worth noting here that even Harry Stack Sullivan, generally regarded as one of the most humanistic modern psychiatrists, succumbed to the lure of an impersonal psychiatric science. Let me say that insofar as you are interested in your unique individuality, you are interested in the really private mode in which you live in, which I have no interest whatever. The fact is that for any scientific inquiry, in the sense that psychiatry should be, we cannot be concerned with that which is inviolably private. Evidently, it did not occur to Sullivan that if this is the price of being scientific, it might be better not to pay it than to betray the patient and forfeit being scientific, in the sense of being truthful in the bargain. The roads to chattel slavery arid psychiatric slavery. Noonan uses the American experience with slavery to illustrate how legal fictions may serve the purpose of dehumanizing persons, and how lawyers and legal scholars may act as agents rather than as critical analysts of the resulting system. Indifference to persons in legal history and legal study, he writes, is dramatically illustrated by their prominent legal scholars' unconcern for a major function of Anglo-American law for 3 centuries, the creation and maintenance of a system in which human beings were regularly sold, bred, and distributed like beasts. Noonan demonstrates how legislators, lawyers, and judges suppressed the common-sense perception that Negro slaves were human beings and said not a word on how the legal system made a person a non-person. How could a lawyer, Noonan asks, look upon persons as kitchen utensils? How can a doctor, we might ask, look upon persons as the carriers of diseased brains or as bundles of unconscious impulses? The split between the ideals of the American Revolution and the maintenance of slavery, adds Noonan, was evident to contemporaries. The split between our ideals of individual liberty and responsibility and the maintenance of institutional psychiatry is no less evident to many people today. But cultural contradictions have plagued most civilizations, and more than impassioned impatience is needed to resolve them. Consider the problem that confronted Americans on the eve of the birth of their new nation. At least half of the property cases before the Chancellor in colonial Virginia involved the disposition of slaves. He could not have compassion for each of them as a person and still be a judge. His role in a slave system necessitated the use of masks. Legal education has often been education in the making and unmaking of persons. Who knows how many cases coming before judges today involve questions concerning the mental health of defendants or litigants? How can judges and psychiatrists have compassion for every single so-called mental patient as a person and still be judges and psychiatrists? They cannot. Thus, combining their efforts and talents, doctors and lawyers, using the mask of mental illness, have created and maintained a system of medical legal fictions to transform citizens into mental patients. That is, free and responsible adults into unfree and no responsible quasi-children. Slavery and psychiatry. Since mask and role are similar but not identical, and since both are useful for our analysis of mental illness, a brief remark about the differences between them is in order here. Like clothes, roles may hide individuality, but can also accentuate and define it, whereas masks conceal, falsify, even obliterate individuality. Unlike a role, a mask, says Noonan, signifies a legal construct suppressing the humanity of a participant in the process. Property, applied to a person, is a perfect mask. no trace of human identity remains. Just so have the various semantic masks used by alienists and psychiatrists, from moral insanity and masturbatory madness to schizophrenia and bipolar illness, suppress the humanity of the mental patient. 3/5 of all other persons. In order to illustrate what is a legal mask, or fiction specifically, the mask that hid the face of the American slave until 1865, and the mask that hides the face of the American mental patient today, I want to present some information with which every educated person is familiar. Few people would deny that the framers of the Constitution of the United States of America comprised some of the finest minds and loftiest spirits that ever graced Western civilization. However, because of the existence of the institution of slavery, they felt it reasonable and indeed necessary in the Constitution itself to define black slaves, without so calling them, as 3/5 human. Thus was a remarkable legal fiction created to legitimize a peculiar human institution. A fiction, let us remember, that Americans found themselves unable to reject without a bloody civil war. Although this painful history is familiar enough, it might be worth quoting the text of the Constitution here as a sobering reminder not only of the difference between legal fiction and truth, but also of the social imperatives energizing such fictions. The preamble to the Constitution declares that its purpose, among other things, is to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Then, in Article 1, Section 2, this revered document states, "Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons." Moreover, the Constitution, and this is perhaps less often remarked on in discussions concerning the constitutionality of this or that policy, not only legitimizes slavery, but makes any interference with it explicitly unconstitutional. No person held to service or labor in one state, under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall, in consequence of any law or regulation therein, be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due. Article 4. In short, the Constitution, ratified less than 200 years ago, specifically denied the notion that the black slave had a claim to liberty, and that those assisting him to escape from slavery were engaging in a legally legitimate enterprise. We might try to remember this when psychiatrists and lawyers righteously tell us that it would be unconstitutional to interfere with the policies of civil commitment and the insanity defense, the legal interventions by which the idea of insanity is legitimized as true and valid. It is sobering to reflect that only a little more than a century ago, human beings were sold and bought in the United States as well as in Russia. Here, slavery was justified by the blackness of the slave. How was it justified in Russia? A brief digression on this seemingly unrelated topic may be rewarding here. The trade in souls. Unlike his American counterpart, the Russian slave, usually called serf, was white. Hence, blackness could not be used to obscure his humanity. Yet his humanity was effectively obscured by a language game that reveals the profound significance of Christianity for the Russian mind. The serf was called a soul. Nor was this a mere euphemism. While there is a Russian word for serf, in the official Russian census, serfs were called souls. The masters had to pay a tax on each serf, hence the need for an official census. Thus, in America, the humanity of the slave was obscured by the legal fiction that he was 3/5 of a person, which degraded him into property. In Russia, the humanity of the slave was obscured by the legal fiction that he was a soul, which, while seemingly exalting him as an immortal spirit, permitted degrading him as a person. Nikolai Gogol's famous satire, Dead Souls, 1842, is based on this metaphoric disguise of the serf. Self-contradiction is, of course, inherent in every master metaphor. How can bread be the body of a god? How can a human being be 3/5 of a person? How can an immortal soul be dead? And how can a living person called a soul be traded like cattle? And most ironically, why would anyone want to buy a dead soul? The protagonist of Dead Souls, the immortal Pavel Ivanovich Chichikov, decides to go into the business of buying dead souls because souls could be used as collateral for a government loan, and because legally, serfs existed and were taxed until formally taken off the rolls by a government census taker. Hence the ultimate legal fiction of the dead soul, the serf that has died between one census and the next, and was therefore de facto dead but de jure alive. The following dialogue, at the beginning of the story, takes place between Chichikov and a woman from whom he wants to buy some dead souls. "Well then, Natasha Petrovna, will you sell them to me?" "Sell what to you?" "Why, all those serfs who died. How can I sell them to you? What do you want them for?" the old woman asked, her eyes popping. "Now that's my business. But since they are dead, and who is trying to maintain that they are alive?" "I really don't know. I've never traded in dead people before. Really, my friend, this has never happened to me before to sell folks who've passed away. When it comes to live ones, I've sold some." Gogol's aim, of course, was to denounce the system of serfdom, which was then accepted as the natural order of things. At the end of the novel, he addresses the reader directly. Isn't there anyone among you who has enough Christian humility to ask himself, not in public, of course, but in private, searching his soul, a question along these lines: am I not, even slightly, somewhat of a Chichikov? And you, Russia, aren't you racing headlong like the fastest troika imaginable? And where do you fly to, Russia? Answer me. She doesn't answer. Jefferson expressed the same sentiment when he wrote, "One tremble for my country when one reflect that God is just." We should all tremble for all of humanity. The case for psychiatric slavery. As the Constitution affirmed the truth of Negro inferiority and the rightness of chattel slavery, so the Supreme Court now affirms the truth of mental illness and the rightness of psychiatric slavery. In the classic case of Robinson v. California, decided in 1962, the Supreme Court asserted the medical reality of mental illness and the legal validity of psychiatric coercions committed in its name, ruling that it is unconstitutional to punish any person addicted to the use of narcotics, because such a condition is a mental disease, and hence its punishment would be cruel and unusual. The court declared, "It is unlikely that any state at this moment in history would attempt to make it a criminal offense for a person to be mentally ill. In the light of contemporary human knowledge, a law which made a criminal offense of such a disease would be unconstitutional." The court's references to "at this moment in history" and contemporary human knowledge are revealing. They imply that we now know something about the human propensity to take drugs that, say, Jefferson did not know. Indeed, the entire Robinson case, and especially Justice William O. Douglas's concurring opinion, reads as a contemporary defense of the reality of mental illness and the rightness of psychiatric slavery. The addict, asserts Douglas, is a sick person. He may, of course, be confined for treatment or for the protection of society. Cruel and unusual punishment results not from confinement, but from convicting the addict of a crime. If addicts can be punished for their addiction, then the insane can also be punished for their insanity. Each has a disease, and each must be treated as a sick person. What the court could not look straight in the face in 1962 is similar to what the framers could not look straight in the face in 1787, namely, their own indenture to their own dominant institutions. Once the United States became a separate nation, it was necessary to count the persons in it. This then raised the problem of who should be counted as a person. If the Negro slave was so counted, he could no longer in good conscience be enslaved. Similarly, once the federal government outlawed the possession and use of certain substances, the possession and use of which were perfectly legal in 1776, and indeed as recently as 1913, it then became necessary to do something with or to the persons who violated that prohibition. This now raises the problem of whether to define and control such persons as criminals or mental patients or both. For the framers, it was unthinkable to regard the Negro slave as a person. For the justices of the Supreme Court today, it is equally unthinkable to regard anti-drug laws as unconstitutional. The addict, Justice Douglas asserted, is a sick person. He may, of course, be confined for treatment, but the addict is no more sick than the Negro is a slave. Any society can tolerate only so much freedom. As liberty is enlarged in one area, it is constricted in another. I believe the contemporary criminalization of possessing and using certain chemicals will seem as bizarre to future generations as the justification of slavery seems to the present one. During the last years of his life, Thomas Jefferson suffered from headache, insomnia, and chronic diarrhea, problems he managed by medicating himself with laudanum, tincture of opium. Although every American president now has the right, under certain circumstances, to launch nuclear missiles, under no circumstances does he now have the right to medicate himself with opium. The case against slavery, chattel and psychiatric. The face that man can conceal by means of legal masks, he can, of course, reveal by means of historical analysis and rational criticism. It does not diminish Noonan's achievement to observe that it is no longer difficult to do what he has done so ably, namely to reconstruct the semantic and legal processes by which the Negro slave was dehumanized. The modern mind unhesitatingly rejects the view that a black human being is property rather than person. Today, the difficult task is to criticize the contention that the madman is a person rather than an insane patient. This is a daunting task now, just as it was a daunting task to defend the humanity of the Negro slave before the Civil War. Linguistic and legal habit served then and serve now to validate a dehumanized and infantilizing slave-insane image of the victim and a superhumanized and paternalistic master-doctor image of the victimizer. From the beginning of the slave trade in the American colonies, writes Noonan, slave and Negro were terms indicating a special legal status. Africans in Virginia, having arrived by means of purchase, were viewed as property. Similarly, since the beginning of psychiatry, with the construction of insane asylums in the 17th and 18th centuries, mad and insane became terms indicating a special legal status. Madmen in madhouses, having been transported to the asylum against their will, were viewed as non-persons. As the semantics of slavery supported the slave trade and the institution of slavery, so the semantics of psychiatry support the trade in lunacy and the institution of psychiatry. In colonial Virginia, legislators and courts presented a doctrine on the morality of slavery. In contemporary America, legislators and courts present a doctrine on the morality of psychiatry. The former taught that slavery was good, identifying slaves with soil and property. As long as the teaching of the lawgivers was accepted, slavery could not be criticized without aspersion on the goodness of wealth itself. In the Virginia Mutatis Mutandis, lawgivers now teach that involuntary psychiatry is good, identifying insanity with ill health and psychiatry with treatment. Thus, as long as the teaching of lawgivers is accepted, psychiatry cannot be criticized without casting aspersions on the goodness of health and treatment. Accordingly, compulsorily, civilly, or criminally hospitalized mental patients are now defined as childlike quasi-persons unable to care for themselves and or unable to control their illegal behavior. In the Virginia colony, property was the supreme category. In America today, health is. For who, in his right mind, can be against health? No one. Our language and laws thus render reasoned opposition to psychiatry all but impossible. Effective legal criticism of slavery awaited the development of a successful refutation of the idea that persons called slaves are not persons. I long maintained that effective legal criticism of psychiatry requires a similarly successful refutation of the idea that persons called mental patients are not persons. In two books, published in 1961 and 1963, one tried to formulate such a refutation. Since my critique is similar to the classic critique of slavery, let me briefly recapitulate the latter, as outlined by Noonan. In this connection, the following passage from C.S. Lewis is an apt reminder. One passes to the realization that our own age is also a period, and certainly has, like all periods, its own characteristic illusions. They are likeliest to lurk in those widespread assumptions which are so ingrained in the age that no one dares to attack or feels it necessary to defend them. Infants, idiots, and the insane were never intended to be included by the Enlightenment humanists and philosophers among persons possessing inalienable rights to life, liberty, and property. Thus, in his two treatises on government, John Locke states, lunatics and idiots are never set free from the government of their parents. Madmen, which for the present cannot possibly have the use of right reason to guide themselves, have for their guide the reason that guides other men which are tutors over them, to seek and procure their good for them. In the past, the principle of paternalism justified the domination of women by men, of blacks by whites, and of colonial people by Europeans. Today, it continues to justify the domination of the insane by the sane. Even contemporary libertarian political philosophers and theorists cannot countenance the idea that individuals whom psychiatrists call insane or psychotic are persons and should be treated as such. Colony. A 1705 statute defined plantation slaves as real estate and merchant slaves as personality. The care and consideration lavished by lawmakers on all forms of property proclaimed to the dullest intellect that ownership was desirable. Property was the most comprehensive and most necessary of social categories. The moral and legal foundation for the opposition to slavery lay in an extremely influential book, published a dozen years before the American Revolution. In his Commentaries on the Laws of England, William Blackstone, the first professor of the laws of England at Oxford and one of the most celebrated English jurists of all time, maintained that English law consisted in the rights of persons and the rights of things. But who were to be counted as persons? Blackstone answered, "Natural persons are such as the God of nature formed us." While accepting the possibility of expanding the category of persons by creating artificial persons, such as corporations, Blackstone rejected the possibility that the category could be artificially contracted. The purpose of man-made law, he insisted, was to protect persons in the enjoyment of those absolute rights which are vested in them by the immutable laws of nature. This reasoning led him to an unqualified rejection of slavery, since it is self-evident that, regardless of skin color, human beings are persons. Slavery is opposed to natural law. My claim that, regardless of psychiatric diagnosis, mental patients are persons is a similar contention. Asserting such a claim, however, runs head-on into the apparently universal passion of human beings to exploit and dominate other human beings, preferably under the guise of some paternalistic ideal. Opposition to slavery was slow in gaining ground because it ran head-on into the defense of slavery as a defense of private property, as well as into its defense as an integral part of Christian compassion and morality. Writing several decades before Blackstone, Montesquieu satirized this obstacle as follows: "It is impossible that we should suppose those people Negro slaves to be men, because if we should suppose them to be men, we would begin to believe that we ourselves are not Christians. While some people still believe they are good because they are Christians, even more people now believe they are good because they profess to help sick people and are willing to support such efforts in the face of any obstacle, be it financial, legal, or scientific. Psychiatrists and their followers are now in the forefront of those claiming to want to help such persons. Since they can do so only if certain individuals are denominated as mentally ill and treated as non-persons, it is impossible for psychiatrists, paraphrasing Montesquieu, to suppose that mental patients are persons, because if they suppose them to be persons, then psychiatrists might begin to believe that they themselves were not therapists. The question of when a human being is not a person, or to put it differently, which human being is in fact not a person, has perplexed humanists, philosophers, psychiatrists, and legislators for a long time, with no end in sight. Montesquieu tried to solve the problem by appealing to our intuition of personhood, an attractive idea but an untrustworthy criterion. The intuition of personhood held by the American founding fathers, surely not a group of evil men, was not wide enough to protect blacks in their personhood. The intuition of personhood held by legislators and psychiatrists today is similarly not wide enough to protect persons called mental patients in their personhood, as the following, now acutely relevant, example illustrates. In January 1986, Newsweek magazine published a feature essay on the homeless mentally ill, which prompted a former beneficiary of mental health services to write to the editor. Many of us so-called homeless mentally ill have preferred the chill of the night air to the cold reality of psychiatric treatment, and the damage of involuntary treatment and incarceration. I am thankful for those who have fought for my constitutional rights to be free from dehumanizing, intrusive treatments. This plea is evidently too simple to be taken seriously in our sophisticated age when we coerce in the name of compassion. Nor do we pay attention to the lesson dumb animals, to whom madmen used to be compared, teach us. After all, do we not provide more food, more comfort, and better health care to the inmates of zoos than they could possibly provide for themselves? Why, then, do we have to cage them? Because they would rather perish in freedom than live in captivity. Just so many mental patients would rather die from psychiatric abandonment than live with psychiatric attention. Have we sunk so low that we actually believe that animals value freedom more highly than human beings? I can think of few instances where the American press and television have failed us more miserably than in their portrayal of the mentally ill. We are now confronted daily with thousands upon thousands of persons who, having experienced the bountiful benefits of the American mental health system, say with actions that speak louder than words that they do not want psychiatric help. How do the men and women of our free press interpret this phenomenon? By telling the freedom-loving American people one thing only, namely that the homeless mentally ill are so crippled in mind that they do not even know how to come in from the rain. I think that is a horribly dangerous misinterpretation. As I see it, we, normal people, have families, jobs, property, which we are all too ready to trade for a little or even a lot of loss of liberty. Homeless mentally ill persons have none of these things. So why should they not cling to liberty, the only thing they have left that can still give them some dignity, with the same desperation with which a drowning man clings to a piece of wood? Why should they not value liberty more, not less, than we do? So long as we refuse to so interpret the predicament of the homeless mentally ill, we will be unable to do anything for them, and will only feel tempted to escalate our violence against them. Of course, many Americans recognized that chattel slavery was not as good for the Negro as its defenders claimed it was, and many now recognize that psychiatric slavery is not as good for the mental patient as its defenders claim it is. But unable to let go of either form of domination, our founders engaged in, as do we, endless and futile efforts at reform. Noonan emphasizes the agonizing moral discomfort that slavery, a well-established institution in 1776, created in the minds of the founders. We know that, and we also know that since they nevertheless wanted to recognize slavery as a legally valid institution, they tried to reform it. After founding a new nation, Jefferson and his fellow lawmakers created new legislation for Virginia that parodied the revolutionaries' statement of the inalienable liberty of human beings. Be it enacted by the General Assembly that no person shall henceforth be slaves within the Commonwealth, except such as were so on the first day of this present session of the Assembly, and the descendants of the females of them. The bill also banned the importation of slaves, thus providing an added incentive for breeding them. Keenly aware of the historical situation in which Jefferson and his fellow creators of the new America found themselves, Noonan asks, can they be blamed for not attempting the impossible, the abolition of slavery? Obviously not, he answers. But Noonan does not stop there. By not attempting the impossible, they reinstituted slavery by law. For that decision they were responsible. That is, it must be recognized that they as human beings performed the acts by which slavery was continued as a legal institution. They chose to participate in the system. With their own hands, they put on the masks of the law and imposed them on others. Noonan rightly observes that Jefferson, Madison, and their fellow lawyers bore a heavy burden of responsibility for perpetuating slavery. Without the lawyers' professional craftsmanship, without their management of the metaphor, without their loyalty to the system, the enslavement by words more comprehensive than any shackles could not have been formed, emphasis added. Similarly, the shackles formed by psychiatric words, reinforced by judicial power and sanctions, now support an intricate web of psychiatric coercions and excuses known as the mental health system. A society in which a subsystem such as slavery or psychiatry is an integral part of a larger social-political system leaves little room for neutrality on the part of the citizen. He either supports the subsystem or he opposes it. If he supports the subsystem in the present, he may, in the future, be considered to have been disloyal to the higher values embodied in the larger system. I recognize that the historical situation today is not compatible with any person or group succeeding in abolishing institutional psychiatry. But is it not better to try to abolish psychiatric slavery and fail than to support it and succeed? Mental illness as canon law fiction. When people think of psychiatry today, they associate it with medicine, science, and the law. And when they associate it with the law, they connect it with the codes of civil and criminal jurisprudence of modern secular societies. It is important to keep in mind, however, that modern psychiatry is also highly respected and fully recognized as a medical science by Western religious bodies, especially the Roman Catholic Church. Although the Church does not formally recognize modern developments in the natural sciences, for example, the bearing of geological knowledge on the age of the Earth or of genetics on evolution, it warmly embraces what it calls developments in the science of psychiatry. A moment's reflection will show us why this should be so. Like civil law, criminal law, and psychiatry, canon law is concerned with issues such as free will, intent, consent, guilt, responsibility, and punishability. Moreover, as a codified system of sanctions, it too needs excuses. In its approach to all of these matters, modern canon law makes extensive use of the legal fiction of mental illness, recognizing insanity as a bona fide illness. Canon law distinguishes between two kinds of insanity, absolute or complete, and relative or partial. Absolute insanity is a mental disease or disorder that renders a baptized person over 7 years of age habitually incapable of any human acts. Such a condition creates a general legal disability regarding the personal exercise of rights, the incurrence of criminal liability, and subjection to ecclesiastical laws. A person absolutely insane assumes the legal status of an infant. Mental illness thus has a somewhat different meaning and function in canon law than in American civil or criminal law. For example, canon law speaks of the rights and responsibilities of children over 7 years old. Under secular law, children of that age have few rights and even fewer responsibilities, regardless of their mental state. As to relative insanity, canon law defines it as follows. A mentally ill person who is not absolutely insane, however, might be insane with regard to a given act. Thus, a person might be legally sane for one thing, e.g. voting validly in an ecclesiastical election, and yet be legally insane for another, e.g. making a religious vow. Canon law also recognizes the doctrine of diminished responsibility. Temporary mental disturbance, e.g. from drunkenness or passion, might remove or diminish immutability. Here, the excuses provided by canon law and forensic psychiatry converge. Moreover, since concepts such as action, intent, and will play a crucial role in religion, we find psychiatric considerations popping up all over the Code of Canon Law, drafted by the Canon Law Society of America. For example, for a marriage to be a valid contract in the eyes of the Church, the parties must have consensual capacity, which, mirabile dictu, is impaired by a wide range of mental disorders. After genuflecting before contemporary advances in medical science, the Canon Law Society of America declares that one may be incapable of a human act at the time of consent for various reasons. The first broad category is mental illness. Considering the scope of DSM-3, this suggests that there may not be many valid Catholic marriages in America today. Sadly, the theologians who have drafted this document view the mentally ill as not fully human. The person suffering from a permanent mental disorder is presumed to be habitually incapable of an internal will act. Since theologians cannot and do not diagnose mental illness, this amounts to ceding a great deal of territory to their psychiatric competitors. To make matters worse still, the priests are particularly impressed by psychiatric advances in sexology. An advance was made in 1957 with a decision which held that although a nymphomaniac was capable of eliciting a will act, she was nevertheless incapable of fulfilling the essential obligations of fidelity, and, therefore, her consent to marriage was invalid. Since the priests failed to mention that men suffering from the dread disease of psoriasis, the male analog of nymphomania, are similarly incapable of consenting to a valid Catholic marriage, it seems that they pick and choose from the rich wares of the psychiatric taxonomist only those items that suit their own purposes or prejudices. This impression is supported by their silence concerning elective abortions, which, psychiatrists maintain, are one of their most effective prophylactic measures against the mental illness caused by unwanted pregnancy. In fairness, it should be said, however, that the Church no longer considers homosexuality a sin. Now that the psychiatrists no longer consider it an illness, the priests at least do. It is an illness, they say, that renders a man, but apparently not a woman, incapable of fulfilling the marital obligations. But would it not be more accurate to say that such a person is unwilling, rather than unable, to fulfill his marital sexual obligation? It gets worse. For example, the priests are positively overawed about the scientific advances psychiatrists have made in understanding the nature and effects of personality disorders. The classification and nomenclature used for the different disorders vary, yet the essential conclusions remain the same. A person gravely afflicted has a severely weakened or non-existent freedom of choice. I cite all this not so much to criticize the churchmen for making what I regard as grave mistakes in moral philosophy, but rather to show the wide-ranging, uncritical acceptance of psychiatry in our day. No important institution, secular or clerical, legal, medical, or scientific, is judiciously skeptical of psychiatric ideas and interventions. The Church's all but complete capitulation to psychiatry is illustrated by phrases such as the following recurring throughout the whole text of the Code of the Canon Law. The clinical diagnosis of a mental disorder, even a tentative one, is a clinical and not a juridical issue. The theologians evidently feel it would be sacrilegious to doubt or disagree with a psychiatrist's clinical diagnosis, even if it is only tentative. One shudders to think what they must think when they are face to face with a definitive psychiatric diagnosis, such as psychohistories like to make, for example, of Jesus. But inconsistencies have never impaired a fiction, legal, or psychiatric. Clearly, the difference between the forensic psychiatry of our secular society and the psychiatric canon law of the Church is like the difference between a glass half full and one half empty. Varieties of fictions, religious, legal, scientific, and psychiatric. My aim in this chapter has been to analyze the idea of mental illness as a legal fiction, much as some years ago, in The Myth of Mental Illness, I analyzed it as scientific fiction. Actually, fictions, or myths, have always been, and always will be, with us. What changes through the ages is not the existence of fictions in society, but their content and consequences. That, indeed, is what we really mean when we speak of social change. Thus, when faith ruled the world, people accepted the fictions of religious mythology legitimized as theological truths. As recently as a few hundred years ago, common folk and leading intellectuals alike believed that saints and demons existed in the same sense that human beings exist. Accordingly, certain abnormal behaviors, now called mental illness, were then viewed as manifestations of possession with good or evil spirits, and the madman, accordingly, was regarded either as a saintly soul obeying divine commandments or as a dangerous maniac possessed by demons. From the 17th century onward, the religious concept of insanity metamorphosed into a medical concept. Ceasing to be a divine inspiration or devilish possession, insanity became an illness. Thus did the age of faith become the age of reason, and thus did insanity become a legal and scientific fiction. It may be useful at this point to review the main differences between these two kinds of fictions. The fiction of mental illness, the usefulness of untruth. Scientific fictions, usually called hypotheses or theories, are attempts to articulate empirically verifiable falsifiable observations. That the Earth is a flat disk, or that space is filled with a colorless and weightless substance called ether, are examples of scientific fictions destroyed by having been proven false. On the other hand, legal fictions, or the fictions of ideologies and religions, are either patently false or not subject to disproof. For example, the existence of gods. In addition, there is an important difference between the way scientific and legal fictions affect ordinary people. The concept of ether, a leading fiction of 19th century physics, had no direct effect on the everyday lives of the American people, whereas the concept of mental illness has a profound, direct effect on the everyday lives of the American people today. Legal fictions, as I have noted, are not attempts to articulate empirically verifiable observations. Black's Law Dictionary identifies a legal fiction not only as an untruth, but specifically as one that the rules of the legal game will not allow to be disproved. The point is that a legal fiction need not be true, it is enough that it be useful. Similarly, the idea of insanity, or any other psychiatric concept, need not be true, it is enough that it be useful. Indeed, the idea of mental illness is now viewed as so indispensable that even sophisticated ethicists and philosophers are unable to see through its fictional character. The following excerpt from an essay by the philosopher Edmund Burke is illustrative. The concept of mental illness has long played an important and for the most part constructive role in human affairs. And for this reason, if no other, it should not be discarded lightly or without good reason. It is, therefore, not surprising that in spite of some well-reasoned attacks on this concept as being unduly identified with a medical model and as reifying a myth, the statutes of almost every jurisdiction in the United States, including some of those most recently revised, persist in relying upon it as the basis upon which to articulate rules for confining those who, though not at fault, seem unable to behave or function normally. That there are such persons in ours as in every society is beyond dispute. The focus of definitional controversy is elsewhere, namely, on the question of who not only fits into the designated category, but fits so manifestly as to require intervention on the part of the state. That such intervention has come to be exercised primarily upon a finding of mental illness is largely a historical accident, one which, however, is readily understandable if one bears in mind the science-centered ethos of modern Western civilization. Emphasis added. Unlike psychiatrists, Burke acknowledges that the cutting edge of the concept of mental illness is the question of who not only fits into the designated category of mental patient, but fits so manifestly as to require intervention on the part of the state. This language falsely implying that the so-called mental patient requires intervention when, in fact, it is those who impose such intervention on him who require it, exemplifies the use of the idea of insanity as a legal fiction. Assuredly, the controversy about mental illness is not merely or abstractly about definitions of illness, it is about power and state intervention, and so it was in the case of slavery too. Burke's final assertion that state intervention has come to be exercised primarily upon a finding of mental illness is largely a historical accident, emphasis added, is absurd. Was it a historical accident that state intervention supportive of slavery was exercised primarily upon a finding of blackness? In fact, nothing but blackness could justify slavery to Americans in the past, and nothing but mental illness can justify psychiatry to Americans today. Insanity is fiction, ideology is reality. Especially when they want to appear candid, legal scholars and philosophers of psychiatry love to mouth, as if it were a kind of epistemological mantra, the assertion that insanity is a legal term, not a medical one, and refers to a legal disability, rather than a medical or psychiatric condition. But if that is what insanity is, why are lawyers so eager to have psychiatrists diagnose it, testify about it in court, and confine those who suffer from it? In chapters I and 3.1 have shown that pathologists do not consider the term mental illness to refer to a disease in the medical sense of the word. Legal scholars, as we have seen, often say that insanity is a legal term, but in fact treat it as if it were a medical concept. Moreover, they also often explicitly repudiate the view that insanity is a legal term and insist that it is a medical concept. Consider the following contradictions. Norval Morris, a professor of law at the University of Chicago, flatly asserts that insanity is not a legal concept. The layman often asks, what is the legal definition of insanity? There is, of course, no such definition. Herbert Fingaret, whom I have cited earlier, asserts just as flatly that insanity is not a medical concept. Insanity, mental illness, mental disease, these are not medical concepts. Shakespeare may have had the right idea when he suggested, the first thing we do let's kill all the lawyers. The more carefully one reads the literature on the legal uses of insanity, the more clearly one sees how brazenly hypocritical the legal scholar's attitude is toward it. For example, Morris's disclaimer notwithstanding, Fingeret offers a legal definition of insanity. It is in connection with responsibility impairment that I think such notions as mental disorder, mental disease, mental illness, insanity, neurosis, et al. Have their root significance. In short, Fingeret wants to remove the element of illness from insanity and to replace it with irrationality. However, as an apologist for psychiatry who approves of coercive mental health measures, he brings mental illness and the psychiatrist back through a side door. Rationality, he urges, especially in association with mental disease, still suggests, as it ought, that testimony from medical men in insanity trials can be both relevant and important. Stephen J. Morse's writings exhibit the same inconsistency. He states that mental health experts have no expertise whatsoever about the ultimate issue of legal insanity precisely because it is a legal issue. But then he too reintroduces the psychiatrist into the picture. Experts, psychiatrists, should be limited to offering both full clinical descriptions of thoughts, feelings, and actions and relevant data based on sound scientific studies. But why, in trying a person accused of a crime, is a clinical description of his thoughts, whatever that might be, preferable to an ordinary description of them? It is obvious why. To justify his psychiatric incarceration. We should be clear that it is unjust to punish someone who is not responsible. A fixed hospital term is also improper for the same reason. Hospital commitment should be related to continuing disorder. Thus, we come back again to the realization that involuntary mental hospitalization is the tail that wags not only the psychiatric dog, but the legal superstructure that is its master, and the society they both serve. These alternating and self-contradictory claims regarding insanity illustrate and support my contention that insanity is a legal fiction. To be sure, it is a legal fiction of a particular sort, one that makes use of psychiatric rather than, say, economic or political concepts and rhetoric. In this respect, too, the idea of insanity resembles the idea of slavery. Legal scholars made inconsistent claims regarding slavery, also defining the status called slave legally, while ostensibly determining who qualifies for it hematologically by asking, how much Negro blood does he have? Although lawyers define the status called involuntary mental patient legally, ostensibly they determine who qualifies for it psychiatrically by asking, how crazy is he? Of course, in the age of chattel slavery, what really mattered was not only how much Negro blood a person had in him, where he was, and who wanted to make him a slave. Similarly, in the modern age of psychiatric slavery, what really matters is not only how crazy a person is, but where he is, and who wants to make him a mental patient. This is why, in the final analysis, lawyers use expert psychiatric testimony, psychiatric rhetoric, and the psychiatric disposition of the targeted person as they see fit. Unlike illness, which in a sense belongs to doctors, insanity belongs to lawyers. Realization of the thoroughly fictional character of the idea of insanity brings us back to square one, namely to the fact that, as human beings, we differ from other animals in being thoroughly symbolic beings. Thus, when we find death unbearable, as most people did until modern times, we make believe that instead of being the end of life, death is its true beginning. Similarly, when we find life unbearable, as many people now do, we make believe that life truly begins only after we attain mental health. In short, with religion we falsify our death, with psychiatry our life. No wonder that M. Scott Peck, a born-again Christian psychiatrist, is now the most widely read mental health guru in the United States. Finally, whatever people mean by insanity, they, professionals and lay people alike, perceive it as an alien power ever ready to enslave and oppress them. This is why I have long maintained that mental illness is an ideological idea that fuels psychiatry as an ideological theory and movement of liberation, promising to liberate the mental patient from his illness. The fact that mental illness is a fiction, and that those posturing as the mental patient's liberators are the problem rather than the solution, has, of course, not in the least impaired the credibility of the mental health movement. The human dread of disorder, and the craving for order through dependency as a remedy for it are so powerful that they obliterate in each generation the memory of what ideological liberators have wrought throughout history. Chapter 12. Mental Illness as Explanation. The worst affliction of all is, and continues to be, that one does not know whether one's suffering is an illness of the mind or a sin. Soren Kierkegaard. My aim in this, the final, chapter, is to briefly review how and why the idea of mental illness has proven to be such a useful explanatory concept. Although the term mental illness is useful mainly because it is considered to be the name of a type of illness, its reference to the mind requires some critical attention also. Accordingly, one shall begin by offering some remarks on the first half of this key term, namely, on what is mental or mind. Is mental illness mental? There is endless talk today about mental illness without people giving much thought to what they mean by qualifying this alleged disorder as mental. 1. Believe it is safe to assert that most people use the adjective mental to indicate that the illness in question is not bodily, as in the humorous assurance, "Don't worry, it's all in your mind." The question, what is mind, has puzzled philosophers and psychologists for millennia, and I am not about to review the billions of words they have said on this subject. Let me suggest only that we distinguish among three concepts, namely brain, behavior, and mind. The first two are not particularly problematic. Brain is a bodily organ, like heart or lung, differing from other organs only in having different functions. As to behavior, while it is not the name of a material object or bodily organ, its referent is equally clear. By behavior, we mean the person's mode of conducting himself, or his deportment, Webster's. In other words, behavior is the name we attach to a living being's conduct in the daily pursuit of life. That is, the way he eats, mates, fights, and so forth. It is important to emphasize that bodily movements that are the products of neurophysiological discharges or reflexes are not behavior. For example, a lion's hunting a prey is behavior, but the constriction and dilation of its pupils in response to light or darkness is not. The point is that behavior implies action, and action implies conduct pursued by an agent seeking to attain a goal. Transcending the riddle of the mind. Because psychiatrists have always claimed that mental illness is like any other illness, I began this book by examining what the experts on diseases, the pathologists, say about this assertion. We thus discovered that these experts recognize no such entity or thing as mental illness. They view the phenomena called mental illness as diseases only insofar as they are diseases of the brain, in which case the term mental illness is redundant and misleading. In addition to interpreting the term mental illness as referring to a species of bodily illness, we might also interpret it as referring to mental diseases, that is, a disease of the mind. But the mind, as we saw, is an abstract noun that cannot, except metaphorically, be said to be sick. So much, then, for the illness part of mental illness. What about the mental part? Since the middle of the last century, the term mind has ceased to be a part of the vocabulary of scientists and has, instead, become a part of the vocabulary of philosophers. This may explain why philosophers write at length about the mind without mentioning mental illness, and why psychiatrists write at length about mental illness without mentioning the mind. As everyone knows, the modern professionals who claim mental illness as their territory are psychiatrists, psychologists, and neuroscientists who, as their names imply, study brains and behaviors. This is why scientific psychiatry and psychology have, in effect, got rid of the mind, and why Colin Wilson is so excited to discover that it is one of the absurd paradoxes of psychology that it has taken 3 centuries to reach the conclusion that men actually possess a mind. Unfortunately, in saying this, Wilson demonstrates that his heart is in the right place. But his mind, pardon that word again, is not. Why should Wilson or anyone think that psychologists and psychiatrists study the mind? They study and control human beings and their behavior. So one agree with Morse Peckham that we would do better to recognize the term mind for what it is. For 2,500 years, the struggle has been going on to decide whether or not the mind is an entity. But there are a good many words, of which mind appears to be an excellent example, for which there is no something. It is an illusion that there is something. The something that the word allegedly names does not exist. What then does mind mean? It does not mean anything. Instead, like mental illness itself, the word mind is a tool we use for certain purposes, especially for the purpose of explaining behavior. Human behavior, Peckham continues, is both predictable and unpredictable. I do not think that such a notion will surprise anyone, but what has been made of it is quite astonishing, for one of the most important uses of the word mind is simply to explain this predictability and this unpredictability by subsuming both under that word. This brings us back neatly to the subject of this chapter, namely, to the idea of mental illness as an explanation of behavior. Since our ideas about explaining insane behavior are inextricably intertwined with our ideas about explaining sane behavior, it is now necessary to relate both the idea of insanity and my critique of it to conventional contemporary psychiatric and philosophical explanations of mentally healthy and mentally sick behavior. Mental illness as brain disease. Many people in and outside of the mental health professions now assume that insanity is a brain disease and thus take it for granted that its explanation must be sought in neurobiological terms. In this way, the presumption that behavior denominated as mental illness is the manifestation of disordered brain function prejudges perhaps is more accurate. Not only what counts as understanding such behavior, but also what counts as trying to understand it. This is why my criticisms of the neuropathological and psychopharmacological fakeries of psychiatry are often misinterpreted as opposition to research about how the brain works, an absurd contention. My objections to the claims of organic psychiatrists lie elsewhere in what I consider to be two fundamental misconceptions. One is a misunderstanding of the differences between the literal and metaphorical meanings of words. The other is a misunderstanding of the relationship between chemical processes in the body and human experiences, or so-called mental states. Empirical discovery cannot change the metaphorical into the literal. We understand the difference between the literal and metaphorical uses of the word father. Suppose, however, that a person did not know this or chose to ignore it and focused instead only on the fact that the priest is called father. Suppose further that, impressed by the literal meaning of the term father, he set out to investigate the private lives of priests in an effort to prove that they are literal fathers. Such a researcher might indeed discover that some priests are real, biological, literal fathers. But what would that prove? Only that some priests have children, who might call them not only father, but also daddy or papa. The origin and functions of the clerical legal term father would remain what they had been. The discovery that some, or even all, metaphorical fathers are also literal fathers would have no bearing at all on the idea of the priest as father. The situation with respect to bodily illness and mental illness is similar. As the designations literal father and metaphorical father come into being in completely different ways and serve completely different functions, so the designations literal disease and metaphorical disease also come into being in different ways and serve different functions. Suppose, then, that someone were to ignore these differences and focus instead on the fact that mentally ill persons are said to be ill and went looking for brain lesions in their heads. Suppose further that he found that some of them had brain lesions. What would he have discovered? Only that these particular persons had brain diseases and were therefore neurologically ill. The origin and functions of the medico-legal term mental illness would remain what they had been. The discovery that some metaphorically ill persons are also literally ill would have no bearing at all on the idea of insanity as an illness. The expectation that chemical processes, abnormalities, will explain mental states, illnesses, rests partly on the foregoing confusion of literal with metaphorical diseases, and partly on a similar confusion of the relationship between brain and behavior. The latter confusion is perhaps best clarified by reference to what we now know about the relationship between bodily chemistry and personal experience. We know, for example, that adrenaline mediates anger and that lactic acid accumulates in muscles during exercise. This makes us realize only more clearly that adrenaline does not cause anger nor lactic acid fatigue. Thus, even if a chemical substance were found in the brain associated with behavior we now call schizophrenic, such a discovery would no more establish the chemical etiology of schizophrenia than did the discovery of adrenaline establish the chemical etiology of anger. The moral unneutrality of the idea that mental illness is brain disease. In addition to the considerations just set forth, I object to the claims of biological psychiatrists because I maintain that it makes no sense to select patients on moral or legal grounds and then study them as if they were medically ill. No sooner does a wicked person, like John Hinckley Jr., show up on the evening news than there is speculation by newscasters, psychiatrists, and the public alike about what kind of mental illness he suffers from. However, when a virtuous person shows up on the news, like the man who at the cost of his own life saved several people from a plane crash in the Potomac, there is no such speculation. Ours would be a strange brain indeed if it would regularly cause horrible behavior but could never cause heroic behavior. I also object to the posture of self-proclaimed scientists who claim a purely scientific interest in advancing brain research because, in the context of contemporary debates about mental illness, such a claim is an exercise in hypocrisy. Interest in brain research, as I have indicated earlier, appears to be scientific and praiseworthy, and so it might be in principle. But it is neither scientific nor praiseworthy in practice when it is used, as it is typically in psychiatry, to justify coercive mental health interventions. To my knowledge, no one publicly identified for his interest in investigating the biological basis of mental illness condemns psychiatric coercions and excuses. I know of no mental health researcher who would be willing to say, approximately, one believe that mental diseases are brain diseases and that we must concentrate our efforts on discovering their precise nature and cure. In the meantime, however, we must stop using the diagnosis of mental illness to justify incarcerating innocent persons and excusing guilty ones. Because of the absence of anything remotely resembling such an expression of opinion by a person interested in organic psychiatry, I conclude that claims about the organic etiology of mental illness and the need for brain research are tactics to conceal psychiatry's not-so hidden agendas, namely, denial of free will and responsibility and justification of coercion. As I have discussed earlier, see Chapter 3, the model of neurosyphilis has no bearing on alleged diseases such as manic depression and schizophrenia. The Treponema pallidum, the microorganism responsible for syphilis, together with the human host's response to it, cause destruction of cells and tissues. Paresis is a progressive disease of the brain which, if untreated, results in death. There is not the slightest evidence for progressive destruction of brain cells and tissues in patients diagnosed as manic depressive or schizophrenic. There is evidence, of course, that the somatic treatments of these unreal diseases cause real destruction of brain cells and tissues. But that is another story. Finally, physicians and scientists who claim that mental diseases will yield their secrets to medical research and then stand revealed as brain diseases act as if such a discovery would automatically obliterate the stubborn moral and legal problems which the behavior of so-called mental patients pose. This is simply not true. Actually, there is nothing unusual about discovering a new disease. Legionnaire's disease and AIDS were unknown 25 years ago. The discovery of AIDS, even though it is an infectious disease with a fatal outcome, has not resulted in the use of that diagnosis as justification for depriving AIDS victims innocent of law-breaking of their liberty or for excusing them of punishment for crimes they have committed. How or why, then, would the discovery that schizophrenia is a brain disease justify the continued use of that diagnosis for civil commitment, involuntary treatment, and the insanity defense? The discovery that schizophrenia is a neurophysiological disorder, say like epilepsy or multiple sclerosis, would strengthen rather than weaken my argument about the problem of free will and personal responsibility associated with the idea of insanity. The epileptic is, of course, not responsible for his epilepsy. That is, he is not responsible for having a seizure threshold lower than that of normal persons. But the epileptic is responsible for his social conduct. Accordingly, epilepsy is not a justification for depriving a person of his liberty or for excusing his criminal conduct. The discovery that a brain lesion renders its victim prone to schizophrenic behavior would make such a person resemble the epileptic. He would not be responsible for his tendency to schizophrenia, but would be responsible for his behavior even when under the influence of his illness. The diagnosis of schizophrenia would thus become just as irrelevant to civil commitment and the insanity defense as the diagnosis of epilepsy is today. The schizophrenic patient, his family, and society would thus continue to face the same problems they face now, except that they would be deprived of the option of managing their problems by having recourse to civil commitment, involuntary treatment, and the insanity defense. In short, viewing mental illness as not an illness and viewing it as being like any other illness converge in a most important consequence, namely, in undermining the rationale for psychiatric coercions and excuses. Finally, the posture, whether held sincerely or hypocritically, of being interested in psychiatry brain research may simply be a symptom of naive scientism. I say this because if our aim is to understand human behavior, especially the sort of dramatic and destructive behavior that typically provokes contentions of mental illness, then why should we consider it more important to investigate how the brain is put together and works than to investigate how a particular person is put together and works? Why should trying to understand the molecular biology of nerve fibers be considered more important and relevant than trying to understand the experience of worthlessness, the desire for attention, boredom, envy, fear, greed, and the many other mental states that make human beings persons? My point is that viewing mental illness as brain disease prejudices our criteria of what counts as a scientific fact. Statements about dopamine receptors, which lay people cannot understand, become facts, while statements about hatred and revenge, which lay people can understand but may not want to, become non-facts. Thus, in a recent highly acclaimed popularization of the discoveries of modern psychiatric science, the reader was offered the following acts. The brain is an organ. It produces thoughts about the same way the kidney produces urine. This fact was supplied by an anonymous neuroanatomist. Aggression is like any other disease. This fact was discovered by Paul Mandel, a neuroscientist at the Center for Neurochemistry in Strasbourg, France. People who act crazy are acting that way because they have too much or too little of some chemicals in their brains. It's just a physical illness. This fact was uncovered by Candace Pert, a researcher at the National Institute of Mental Health in Bethesda, Maryland. Schizophrenia, the most expensive and devastating of all the common mental illnesses, has been revealed as a physical ailment involving a malfunction in the dopamine system at the base of the brain. This fact was told to John Franklin, the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of The Mind Fixers, by all of the neuroscientists he interviewed for his series of articles on mental illness. Not surprisingly, the result of all this research on mind fixing is the bizarre distortion of reality that has long characterized psychiatry. For example, it is now accepted as a fact that John Hinckley Jr. suffers from schizophrenia and that schizophrenia is a brain disease. But it is not accepted as a fact that he shot President Reagan because he wanted to, and that he is now being punished rather than treated in a mental hospital. Free will and determinism. Undergirding the controversy concerning mental illness, in other words, concerning what constitutes the correct explanation of certain abnormal, bizarre, deviant, despicable, destructive, or self-destructive behaviors, lies the age-old controversy about free will and determinism. As everyone knows, the explanation of human behavior most deeply rooted in Western thought accounts for personal conduct in terms of free will, that is, by attributing the actor's behavior to his choice of a particular aim and the means he selects for attaining it. A person acts in a certain way because he wants to bring about a certain consequence, for example, gratifying his desire for food or sex, money or power. An act here is seen as a consequence of personal choice. The other explanation makes use of a diametrically opposite principle. Instead of accounting for personal conduct in terms of aims or goals, it accounts for it in terms of causes or compulsions, such as poverty or mental illness. In contrast to teleological or motivational explanations of human behavior, deterministic explanations are causal, based on the assumption that personal conduct results from certain anterior events. Thus, a person acts in a particular way because demons, poverty, genes, or mental illness compel him to so behave. Personal choice has nothing to do with the matter. The roots of this dichotomy lie in the fact that the most important characteristic distinguishing human beings from animals, plants, and non-living things is that we possess a highly developed capacity to use symbols. This capacity is manifested by creating, sending, receiving, and interpreting messages ranging from simple gestures and grunts to incredibly complex verbal, mathematical, musical, and other notations. It is these specifically human characteristics that account for culture and for two important cultural phenomena. One is the primitive, animistic misinterpretation of all signs as of the same kind, regardless of whether they are given off passively, like the signs of an impending storm by a darkening sky, or are given actively, like the signs formed by human speech. The other is the modern, materialistic misinterpretation of all signs, again as of the same kind, regardless of whether they are given off, like the electrocardiographic signs of a myocardial infarction, or are given like the linguistic signs of delusions. The animistic interpretation of nature, as the term implies, entails viewing all signs as portents issued by imaginary agents fashioned after the model of human beings. Rain, drought, earthquake, disease, death, everything that happens in the world is thus interpreted as an expression of the sentiments, desires, or wills of gods, ghosts, or spirits. In such a world, nothing happens. Everything is willed by quasi-human agents. The materialistic interpretation of nature, as the term implies, entails viewing all signs as the manifestations of physico-chemical processes, such as human beings observe when they look at nature. Joy and sadness, fear and elation, anger, greed, all human aspirations and passions are thus interpreted as the manifestations of unintentional, immoral, biochemical, and biophysical processes. In such a world, nothing is willed, everything happens. Accordingly, while the animistic savage interprets natural deaths, for example, deaths due to injury or disease, as murder, the scientific psychiatrist interprets unnatural deaths, for example, deaths due to suicide or murder, as happenings instead of actions. Ironically, the psychiatric explanation of mentally ill behavior suffers from the same sort of error as does the animistic explanation of natural events. While the psychiatrist views human actions as the consequences of natural events, the primitive views natural events as the consequences of choice by quasi-human agents. As the primitive had spiritualized nature, so the psychiatrist now animalizes man. It seems that when we try to explain the human condition, we human beings have a hard time finding a happy medium between making too much or too little of intentionality. When we are culturally underdeveloped, we treat objects as agents. When we are culturally developed, we treat agents as objects. Thus, the primitive tries to understand nature in terms of human nature, while the psychiatrist tries to understand human nature in terms of nature. In our roles as modern scientists, we have corrected the savage's mistake. Who will correct the psychiatrist's mistake, and ours for supporting it? The search for causes in psychiatric explanations. Psychiatrists and other behavioral scientists continue to pour out an uninterrupted stream of articles and books allegedly demonstrating that man has no free will. By debunking free will and responsibility, professionals in the mental health discipline seek to legitimize themselves as bona fide scientists. At the same time, they also try to endear themselves to the politicians and the public by promising to control crime, which they call excessive violence. Typical of this trend, and much loved by the press and the public alike, is the claim that medical science has finally proved that violence is caused by brain disease, and that medical specialists can, on the basis of objective evidence, predict future violence. In a major story on the Fourth World Congress of Biological Psychiatry in the Science section of the New York Times, the reporter quotes Alan Gruber, director of neuropsychobiology at the Center for Memory Impairment and Neurobehavioral Disorders in Boston, stating, "I would submit to you that we can predict human aggressive behavior 90% of the time." Another speaker, Frank Elliott, a neurosurgeon, described exhaustive studies of 321 excessively violent individuals, of whom more than 90% showed evidence of brain dysfunction and neurological defects. Added Elliott, "We have been looking at abnormal brains for a generation and calling them normal. Needless to say, the scientists who make such claims do not bother to define what constitutes aggressive behavior or excessive violence. Is a professional boxer or bullfighter engaged in violent behavior? Or a member of the French military forces blowing up an unarmed ship in a New Zealand port? Attributing violent behavior to brain mechanisms is, of course, only the bioneuropsychoscientist's foot in the door of free will." After removing the idea of responsibility from our explanations of so-called criminal or violent behavior, he moves on to complete the determinist's dream, the destruction, once and for all, of the idea of free will. "Is free will a fraud?" asks Richard Restak, a well-known physician writer on brain-mind problems, in the title of an essay published in Science Digest. In the subtitle, he answers his question, "Do we make our own choices, plot our destinies? Are we truly conscious?" New research indicates that the answer to all of these questions may be no. What evidence does Restak have to support his contention? None. Where in the brain does this free will reside, he asks. His answer speaks for itself. There is not a center in the human brain involved in the exercise of will any more than there is a center in the brain of the swan responsible for the beauty and complexity of its flight. It is such research and such reasoning that now pass for behavioral research and behavioral science. The case against psychiatric determinism. Whether the idea of insanity explains or explains away, whether it solves or creates a problem, comes down to a simple question. Do we want two types of accounts of human behavior, one to explain the conduct of sane or mentally healthy persons, and another to explain the conduct of insane or mentally ill persons? I maintain that we do not need and should not try to account for normal behavior one way, motivationally, and for abnormal behavior another way, causally. Specifically, I suggest that the principle, actions speak louder than words, can be used to explain the conduct of mentally ill persons just as well as it can the behavior of mentally healthy persons. Consider, by way of illustration, the following typical cases of insanity reported in the press. Willie Robinson, 42, was placed under police protection at the Wesson unit of Bay State Medical Center in Springfield, Mass. Yesterday, June 23, 1980, a short time after he allegedly went berserk with a long-bladed kitchen knife in the crowded waiting room of the hospital's Springfield unit. At the hospital, Robinson assaulted the guard and several women and allegedly pinned a 6-year-old boy to the ground near an ambulance entrance and stabbed him repeatedly, screaming, "I'm the king! I'm the king! Now I've done it! I'm done!" The boy died. A Roxdale, Ontario woman signed her husband out of a psychiatric ward against medical advice days before he stabbed her 58 times in front of their 3 children, an Ontario Supreme Court jury heard yesterday. William Seaman, 41, pleaded not guilty yesterday to second-degree murder by reason of insanity. Lawyers on both sides of the case agreed that Mr. Seaman should be found insane. The insanity finding needed only the jury's official approval, and that took less than 15 minutes. The jury was told that Mr. Seman, an auto body worker who came to Canada from Hungary in 1957, was admitted to the psychiatric ward of Etobicoke General Hospital last April 18th, 3 days before the murder. Metro Police Sergeant Donald Sampson testified that Mr. Seman told him he worked with Germans, Hungarians, and Poles who hated him because he had fought against them during the last World War. Mr. Seman would have been 7 when the war ended. Mr. William Peacock, neighbor, said that Mr. Seman, walking by him after his arrest, said, "She was trying to poison me." There was no evidence that was true. The pattern obvious in the behavior of these and other like-minded persons, yet systematically neglected in psychiatric theorizing about them, has several significant features. 1. The so-called patient engages in dramatically destructive acts, injuring or killing people. 2. The patient makes false claims about himself, that he is a king or that he fought in the Second World War and was being poisoned by his wife. 3. The patient justifies what he has done, as a right as king or god, or as self-defense against being poisoned. 4. The patient feels relieved by his act and exults in it. In the first case, the killer exclaimed, "Now I've done it. I'm done." In the second, he was found prancing and dancing near the body of his wife, which lay on the pavement in the driveway. The standard psychiatric explanation, which attributes such berserk acts to an acute, overwhelming disorder of the brain, rendering the patient irrational and violent, does not and cannot account for any of these features. In particular, it cannot account for why the patient feels proud rather than ashamed of what he has done. In the language of the McNaughton Rule, the oldest Anglo-American test of criminal insanity, such malefactors are said not to know right from wrong. But this is patently not true. In fact, they insistently assert their judgments of right and wrong. The evidence thus points not to their inability to judge right from wrong, but to their inversion of our judgments of right and wrong. Stripped of psychiatric rhetoric, a person is typically diagnosed as psychotic when two conditions obtain. First, that by conventional standards he behaves very badly, often threatening to kill himself or others. Second, that he justifies his misbehavior in a conventionally unjustifiable way, often by claiming that what he had done is good, not bad. The attempt to explain psychosis psychiatrically faces another serious difficulty, which can be summed up in the following question. Why do certain hypothesized brain diseases causing psychoses invariably manifest themselves in dramatically bad behavior rather than in dramatically good behavior? Somatic disease processes manifest themselves in bodily changes in both directions. For example, a person may have too few red cells in his blood or too many. His blood pressure may be too low or too high. His heart may beat too slowly or too fast. He may be underweight or overweight. He may be shorter and weaker than the average or taller and stronger. Revealingly, the disease we call psychosis never works that way. The psychotic patient attacks and kills people, but never assists and helps them. Why are we psychiatrists as well as lay people so eager to attribute wicked behavior to psychosis, and why do we never attribute virtuous behavior to it? The answer is obvious, because good deeds do not disturb and threaten us. Hence, good deeds do not generate a desire to explain them away by attributing them to insanity, nor do the doers of good deeds make us feel that we must protect ourselves from them by diagnosing them as mentally ill and depriving them of liberty. Of course, like all human behavior, so-called insane behavior has a variety of motivations. Many such acts, for example, those illustrated by the stories I have cited, are inspired by an intense craving for attention and fame in a person who can achieve that goal in no other way than through a dramatic act of violence. Such an act and its aftermath also satisfy the actor's intense craving for being distracted from his own insignificance, from the drudgery and ordinariness of his everyday existence and its frustrations, in short, from the bleakness and futility of his life. Insanity, then, has this in common with war. Each provides a surpassingly successful distraction from everyday problems. Insanity for the individual, war for society. Mental health as action, mental illness as event. Psychiatrists are not the only persons professionally concerned with human behavior and the predicaments of the human condition. Among others concerned with this subject, the most important ones are philosophers, ethicists, and jurists. Without their support, the views now generally regarded as psychiatric, and to which I usually so refer, could not have come into being and could not have become as dominant as they have. It is a curious and exceedingly interesting fact, the details of which cannot detain us here, that all great modern philosophers and students of human behavior, John Locke, David Hume, John Stuart Mill, even Ludwig von Mises, have taken for granted that while most human behaviors can be attributed to motives and make sense, some behaviors have no motives and are bizarre or senseless. In short, rational behavior is the behavior of sane persons, irrational behavior, the behavior of insane persons. The philosopher Peter Winch puts it this way. It is important to notice that, in the sense in which I am speaking of rules, it is just as true to speak of the anarchist as following rules in what he does, as it is to say the same thing of the monk. The difference between these two kinds of men is not that the one follows rules and the other does not. It lies in the diverse kinds of rules which each respectively follows. The anarchist's way of life is thus a way of life. It is to be distinguished, for instance, from the pointless behavior of a berserk lunatic. This statement is a remarkable example of the hold the psychiatric perspective has even on the best of minds. Yet this view of the lunatic's behavior, albeit now shared by scientist, philosopher, and layman alike, is not only odd, it is also false. I call this view odd because the point of the berserk lunatic's behavior is perfectly obvious, often painfully so. Its sense lies, and may be inferred from, its aim or consequence, in exactly the same way as we ascertain the sense of a normal person's behavior. For example, a berserk lunatic may claim to be Jesus or kill his wife. The point of such a person's behavior, I dare say, is to be revered like Jesus or be rid of his wife. Why a person chooses such ends and means is another question, the answer to which is often easily obtained by asking him. Moreover, since people, including philosophers, often do not know whether a person is or is not a lunatic until psychiatrists identify him as such, it is not true that such a person's behavior is prima facie pointless. On the contrary, the fact is that when we find a certain behavior exceptionally disturbing, we say that the actor is a lunatic or psychotic, and that his behavior is senseless or pointless. We used to say that such a person was a witch or was possessed by demons. Whether we realize it or not, when we call a person a lunatic or psychotic or mentally not responsible, we are engaged in giving things names which, as Thomas Carlyle wisely observed, are but custom-woven, wonder-hiding garments. Witchcraft, and all manner of spectre work and demonology, we have now renamed madness and diseases of the nerves. Seldom reflecting that still, the new question comes upon us. What is madness? What are nerves? The imagery of insanity, of senseless, mentally sick actors performing bizarre acts, is a fiction that psychiatrists have labored long and hard to foist upon us, and themselves, as facts. Because of their efforts, and more particularly because of the efforts of post-Enlightenment men and women to deny the existential and moral depths to which human beings may sink, it is now generally accepted that insane persons are irrational and not responsible for their conduct. Because this belief performs indispensable services in modern societies, it is accepted as true. Cui bono? Because of the reasons previously discussed, virtually every educated person now believes that some human behaviors are actions, the consequences of personal choice, while others are events, the consequences of mental illness. The fact that this dichotomy and the premises built into it lies at the heart of all contemporary attempts to explain insanity cannot be exaggerated. The typical first step in explaining the behavior of a mentally ill person is thus to view it as a non-action. Michael Moore states it clearly when he writes, "The bodily motions of epileptics during a grand mal seizure, or perhaps the word salads of schizophrenics, would seem to be non-rational activities." This kind of pattern of action is the primary symptom of the mental incapacities we label mental illness. Being mentally ill means being incapacitated from acting rationally in this fundamental sense. I have discussed the error or advantage of this strategy before. See Chapter 7. The bodily motions of an epileptic during a grand mal seizure are not irrational or non-rational acts because they are not acts at all. Surely, it would be more honest to admit that we regard the acts of insane persons as irrational because they are, or because we believe they are, false or wicked. In short, because they contradict the facts and violate the rules of life as we, and others in our society, see them. But that is not what we do. If it were, there would be no mental illness to write about. What we do, consistent with the belief that sane persons act responsibly, and that insane persons are the victims of an illness for which they are not responsible, and which makes them not responsible, is that we let psychiatrists and philosophers construct a special set of explanations to account for the behavior of persons said to be mentally ill, and let lawmakers attach a special set of excuses to behaviors categorized as mental symptoms, and a special set of justifications to behaviors categorized as mental treatments. For example, psychiatrists and others accept that the mentally healthy person who sets his house afire to collect the insurance does so to accomplish his particular aims, and call him an arsonist. But they insist that the mentally ill person who sets his house afire does so because his illness compels him to do it and call him a pyromaniac. In the same way, psychiatrists distinguish between the thief and the kleptomaniac, the responsible murderer and the no-responsible schizophrenic, and so forth, maintaining that mentally healthy persons commit crimes because they choose to, and mentally sick persons because they are compelled to. Conventional psychiatrists, and I agree about why the arsonist, thief, or other mentally healthy person commits a crime. We disagree about why the mentally ill person does so. I believe we can extend the type of explanation we use to account for the behavior of the mentally healthy person to account for the behavior of the mentally ill person as well. To be sure, there may be dramatic differences in the goals each pursues. For example, one may set a fire to make money, while another may do so to gain attention or get room and board in a publicly financed institution. The point is that both types of persons can, given the appropriate incentive or punishment, refrain from setting fires. The psychiatrist posits the existence in nature of two different types of human beings: the mentally healthy and the mentally ill, the rational and the irrational. The actions of the former, he claims, are properly explained teleologically, in terms of goals. Those of the latter, however, must be explained causally, in terms of mental diseases and irrational impulses. Against this view, I maintain that we do not deal here with two different classes of human beings, but with two different types of explanations of human action. The proof of this pudding lies in the fact that the psychiatrist has no objective way of ascertaining which person belongs in which category. How, then, does he make the distinction? By means of what he calls clinical judgment, a euphemism concealing moral judgments behind pseudoscientific diagnoses and social strategies behind pseudo-therapeutic dispositions. In short, I contend that the idea of insanity need not be true or valid. It is enough that it be useful. Thus, the real question before us remains: how is the idea of mental illness useful? I hope that in the preceding chapters I have succeeded in answering this question. Since not a day passes without newspapers reporting a story illustrating the utility of mental illness explanations, I want to add here a recent, wonderfully revealing example of it. Everyone knows that some white persons dislike black persons, and vice versa. However, discrimination based on skin color, especially in publicly financed jobs, is now against the law. Differential treatment based on mental health considerations is another matter, as the following news item illustrates. Louisville, KY, June 7, 1985. This city may have to find an all-white job setting for a city employee because he says he has a mental problem that makes him fear working with blacks. The Kentucky Workers' Compensation Board ordered a search for a job with all-white coworkers for Gary Pearl, a 39-year-old former street cleaning supervisor. Mr. Pearl was granted a disability benefit of $231.47 a week until he returned to work. The board, in a unanimous ruling April 29th, ordered that Mr. Pearl undergo therapy and that exhaustive efforts be made to find a job for him in an all-white setting if necessary for his employability. Clearly, the idea of insanity is not merely useful, it is indispensable. In much the same way, religious ideas were indispensable until recently. "Who is there who does not see," wrote Thomas Hobbes in Leviathan, "to whose benefit it conduceth, to have it believed that a king has not his authority from Christ unless a bishop crown him." Actually, in Catholic countries, many did not see that because they did not want to see it, much as most people today, because they do not want to see it, do not see the ritual political character of psychiatry's paradigmatic procedures. If mental illness did not exist, as I have noted earlier, mental hospitals, or madhouses, as they were originally called, came first, and mental illness second. In other words, the social system of confining lunatics preceded the idea that the persons so confined were ill. Why do one think this is so important? Because the idea of mental illness as an illness conceals the simple fact that the primary function of the public mental hospital has always been, and still is, to provide room and board for society's miserables, the homeless, the unskilled, the unemployed, those unable or unwilling to care for themselves and for whom no one else is willing to care. Once in a great while, even psychiatrists acknowledge this, as does C.H. Hardin Branch, professor of psychiatry at the University of Utah, when he remarks that we are left with the tired, the poor, the unwanted, the disengaged, the unproductive, the people who are neither physically ill nor morally evil. This caretaking function, previously provided by the churches or the keepers of poor houses, if provided at all, had to be and has to be rationalized and justified. Why should able-bodied healthy people be given free room and board? That is, room and board at the taxpayer's expense. And why should physicians, medical doctors, provide this service? Because, so goes the answer, the persons served are the mentally ill, and it is this illness that renders them unable to care for themselves. But, if they are ill and hospitalized, why are they confined like prisoners, unable to leave, forbidden to reject the care so solicitously given them? Because, so goes the answer, mental illness deprives the mentally ill of their ability to determine and pursue their own best interests. Hence, they must be cared for compulsorily, like children. In addition, madmen and madwomen were, and still are, considered to be dangerous or potentially dangerous to themselves or others. Thus, confining the insane was, and still is, justified on the dual grounds of parens patriae and the police power. The mental patient must be protected from himself, and the community must be protected from the mental patient. Similar considerations apply to the other paradigmatic psychiatric procedure, the insanity defense. As civil commitment rests on and enshrines the belief that there are two kinds of innocent persons in the world, sane and insane, so the insanity defense rests on and enshrines the belief that there are two kinds of guilty persons in the world, sane and insane. Sane persons possess the rights and responsibilities accorded to them by law. Insane persons, because of mental illness, possess no such rights and responsibilities. Ergo, members of the latter group may rightly be incarcerated even if they do not break the law, and if they do, then they ought to be treated, not punished. This explains why incarcerating innocent persons in mental hospitals and freeing guilty persons from prisons have always been, and continue to be, the psychiatrist's two most important social functions. Clearly, if mental illness did not exist, it would be necessary to invent it. Confronting the human predicament. Although modern man has rejected the revelatory tales of the Bible, he has replaced them with the apocalyptic pseudo-explanations of psychiatry and psychoanalysis. The view that the human condition is so mysterious that it is past ordinary human understanding, that some special knowledge or skill is needed to peer into its depths, has thus remained essentially unchanged. In biblical times, people turned to prophets to unravel the mystery of life, and prophets there were aplenty. During the better part of 2 millennia in the Christian West, people turned to the scriptures to unravel it, and priests there were aplenty. Nowadays, they turn to psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, and other experts on mental health, and such experts there are aplenty. Moreover, as in homeopathic medicine where poisons cure what they cause, in psychiatry, mystery explains mystery, hence the apocalyptic character of psychiatric theories. But the idea that our life is a dark mystery, that our personal problems cannot be understood by common sense, intelligent inquiry, and some earnest effort, that the secrets of our inner life or unconscious mind can be penetrated and unraveled only by a few select adepts, all this is false. Understanding why people act the way they do, what they value, and what gives their lives meaning is far easier than understanding the atomic structure of matter or the chemical composition of stars millions of light years from the Earth. Throughout this book, I have tried to show that while people ostensibly believe that mental illness exists and look to psychiatrists to explain what it is, in fact, people use the idea of mental illness to explain certain human predicaments and to justify certain social policies. In its explanatory or pseudo-explanatory function, psychiatry thus resembles and is a replacement for religion. I shall briefly sketch the parallels between them. Psychiatric and religious explanations of behavior. Although the resemblance between religious and psychiatric explanations of behavior has been noted by some students of the human condition, few have seen it as clearly as Morse Peckham. Human beings, Peckham emphasizes, cannot live without constantly manufacturing explanations of their own behavior and of the behavior of others. We cannot manage others without explanation, nor can we manage ourselves. We justify our actions and our plans by explaining their importance, their value, both to ourselves and to others. Social interaction without explanation is inconceivable. It may be the very condition of human existence. Man's passion for explanation, however, is both his glory and shame, or, as Peckham puts it, it is man's cross that the constructive power of explanation is equaled by its destructive force. The reason for this, according to Peckham, with whose interpretation I agree, is that the human mind is too easily satisfied. Inexplicability is satisfied by an explanation, and everybody is satisfied by any explanation some of the time. In support of this seemingly self-evident but important observation, Peckham offers the following comments. They, inexplicable phenomena, must be caused and caused, moreover, by unobservable, not, note, unobserved forces. The unobservable force producing entity for which a word exists is the mind. Therefore, if the responder judges himself to be culturally modern, he asserts that such phenomena are mentally produced. If he is willing to be judged more old-fashioned, he uses another word which is said to refer to an unobservable force-producing entity, God. What Peckham suggests is that psychiatric, mental explanations of behavior are in fact merely restatements of religious divine explanations of it. He thus sees the entire economic institution of psychiatry as satisfying our need for explanations of behavior. Psychoanalysis, he adds, has been a great gift precisely because it makes rich explanations of absolutely any behavioral dissolution quite easy, and it provides an extraordinary and by now nearly random range of such explanations. Its trouble, as has been said often enough, is not that it explains, but that it explains entirely too much. Being in possession of a system that explains too much, together with the conviction that one is so right and others so wrong that one is justified, in the name of one's beliefs, to coerce others are the twin threads that run through the entire fabric of religion, psychiatry, and psychosis, and point to certain crucial characteristics they share. I summarize these characteristics by epitomizing the explanations they typically offer, as follows. The religious person's, fanatic's, explanations of behavior are God-centered, reflecting his overabsorption with his deity and its demands. The typical form of such an explanation is, those who love God and submit to his laws are pure and will be saved. All others are corrupt and terrible punishment awaits them. The psychiatrist's, psychoanalysts' explanations are mental illness-centered, reflecting his overabsorption with psychopathological entities and their consequences. The typical form of such an explanation is, the patient is mentally ill, bent on harming others or himself. I, his psychiatrist, and his family are mentally healthy, and all our efforts are devoted to helping the patient get well. The psychotic's, schizophrenic's explanations are self-centered, reflecting his overabsorption with his own self, his desires and frustrations. The typical form of his explanation is, I am a harmless person, innocent of malicious thoughts or deeds. I am persecuted and tortured by misguided relatives and destructive psychiatrists. In short, the crucial similarities among religious, psychiatric, and psychotic explanations and among the persons who deeply believe in them are 1. Each of these systems of ideas, that is, religion, psychiatry, psychosis, is capable of explaining everything. 2. The true believer of each is willing and indeed eager to explain everything. Saying, I don't know, or it is none of my business, is alien to his thinking and to what he regards as his duty. 3. Because each of these actors feels strongly that he is right and that those who disagree with him are wrong, and is also convinced that his being in possession of the truth imposes special responsibilities on him, each feels deeply justified in using fraud and force to impose his views and will on others. The result is utter cognitive chaos about what is mental illness, what causes it, and what cures it. To underscore the present impossibility of intelligently discussing the nature or causes of mental illness, I have listed its principal meanings, discussed throughout this book, in Table 12.1. Clearly, if this is the way the term mental illness is used, it is folly to try to ascertain what it is, what causes it, or how to cure it. Table 12.1. The meanings of mental illness. Mental illness as abnormal condition. 1. Proven disease of the brain. 2. Putative disease of the brain. Deviant behavior. B. Mental illness as patient role. 1. Voluntary mental patient. Person assumes the role of mentally ill patient. 2. Involuntary mental patient. Person is cast into the role of mentally ill patient. See mental illness as strategy. 1. To accuse or incriminate. 2. To excuse or exonerate. 3. To avoid or evade moral conflict. 4. To deny human depravity. D. Mental illness as legal fiction. 1. To justify involuntary mental hospitalization and treatment. 2. To justify the insanity defense and other psychiatric diversions. 3. To justify coercions and excuses incompatible with our moral and legal principles, and thus legitimize disjoining rights and responsibilities. Mental illness as a barrier to understanding. If this analysis of the explanatory function of the idea of mental illness is correct, then it follows that instead of explaining anything, mental illness is actually like a stone wall or a smokescreen that keeps us from approaching or seeing what ostensibly interests us and what we want to explain. Thus, the most formidable barrier against progress in psychiatry lies in the fundamental political philosophical premise that the psychiatrist's account of the psychotic's behavior constitutes an explanation, but that the schizophrenic's account of his own behavior does not. Accordingly, the psychiatrist feels justified in dismissing the latter as the senseless symptoms of a psychotic patient. Actually, understanding the nature of this disqualification of the ideas of insane persons is crucial for our understanding of the revisioning of mental illness and psychiatry I am proposing. Once madness became an accepted category in Western thought, insane persons were demarcated from sane persons by the different ways their behavior was interpreted and hence seen. Initially, the mad person was viewed as had been the person possessed by demons, that is, as not a person at all, or as not himself because he had been dispossessed of himself by demons or the disease that possessed him. By the beginning of the 19th century, the insane person's thought, speech, and behavior were authoritatively regarded as meaningless. Imitating the modern physicians viewing bloody urine as a pathological product of diseased kidneys, the asylum physician insisted that the madman's utterances were the pathological products of his fevered brain. Another metaphor, to be sure, but one that was also interpreted literally. Herein lay the first and most fundamental disqualification of the insane person's self-explanation. The next disqualification, which did not displace the first but rather coexisted with it, consisted of viewing the insane person's utterances and behavior as irrational. This led to the interpretation that although the psychotic's speech and behavior were speech and behavior, they made no sense. Psychiatric terms such as word salad and thought disorder betoken this view of granting the psychotic's productions the sense of being nonsense. This was the scene upon which Freud entered. Before him stood a stage upon which mad men and mad women performed, spoke, and acted, and whose performances were officially deemed to make no sense. It was a setting ready and waiting for someone. He had to be a physician, of course, to decipher the meaning of madness. It does not belittle Freud's achievement to point out that since everyone then believed that what crazy people said made no sense, it was relatively easy to show that this was not so. All one had to do was listen to what the patient had to say and recast it in one's own authoritative voice. Presto, thanks to a novel medical theory, the insane person's speech and behavior made sense and could be understood. In my view, here is where Freud betrayed the patient and the truth. Instead of validating the mental patient as a bona fide moral agent, he invalidated him once more, and in the subtlest of all ways, as a person who does not understand himself and hence can give no valid account of his own behavior. Only the psychoanalyst, psychiatrist, can do that. As a result, while in the 19th century only the psychotic person's behavior was viewed as senseless, under Freud's influence, this perspective was extended to the so-called neurotic persons, and indeed to everyone's behavior as well. All of us are in the grip of unconscious drives and impulses, hence none of us knows himself. Freud's enthusiasm for viewing all human behavior as irrational is perhaps the clearest manifestation of the fact that notwithstanding certain humanistic and ennobling elements in his doctrine, his fundamental attitude toward men and women was anti-humanistic and degrading. With the Freudian premise that everyone is irrational until proven otherwise, we have indeed come a long way from the days when Thomas Jefferson wrote indignantly that it is an insult to our citizens to question whether they are rational beings or not. In our day, it is the mark of the compassionate and informed citizen, especially if he is a mental health professional, policeman, prosecutor, or judge, that at the very first sign of a difference or disagreement between himself and another person, he ought to question whether the other is rational, assume that he is not, and that his irrationality is a symptom of insanity, and treat him as such to ensure the proper cure of his underlying craziness. The upshot of this profound ideological transformation is that the meaning of the mental patient's self-history is thrice invalidated, first as the pathological secretion of a diseased brain, then as the irrational ravings of an insane person, and finally as the symptomatic derivative of unconscious mental processes to which only the psychoanalyst has access. The reluctance to grant explanatory status to the mental patient's self-explanation is, of course, an integral part of the modern deification of science as the only key to correct explanation. We have somehow forgotten that granting an account the status of an explanation is not the same as agreeing with it as true or valid. After all, we grant such a status to religious and mythological explanations without necessarily agreeing that they represent reality correctly. If we bear this distinction in mind, it is obvious that the verbal behavior of the psychotic, that is, the cognitive content of his psychosis, constitutes a bona fide explanation of behavior. This is especially clear in the case of the paranoid schizophrenic, whose explanations are especially elaborate and dramatic. Of course, we, normal persons, do not and need not agree with or accept his explanation. However, what makes it particularly difficult for people to adopt such a view is that the psychotic's explanations are intolerably offensive, typically for his family, for psychiatrists, and for anyone obsessed with rationality. This is why normal persons prefer to view such accounts as not explanations at all, a posture sadly at odds with Samuel Johnson's dictum that every man has the right to utter what he thinks is truth, and every other man has the right to knock him down for it. Clothes, but no emperor. Inventing metaphors and then mistaking them for the names of material objects is an inevitable part of the human condition. In the past, this enterprise characterized religion. Today, it characterizes the so-called sciences of man, that is, sociology, psychology, and especially psychiatry. Thus, psychiatrists now believe in the reality of delusions and psychoses, and psychoanalysts in the reality of the libido and the unconscious with the same fervor with which theologians believed in the reality of demons and witches and the high temperature and humidity that prevailed in hell. Exploding such myths is often compared to the discovery that the legendary emperor, whose finely woven clothes anyone but a fool could see, is naked. Although this is true, turning the story around makes it even truer. After all, one of the most striking things about modern psychiatry is that it is a veritable cornucopia of theories and therapies of mental illness. Textbooks of psychiatry often exceed in size textbooks of medicine. Explanations of mental illness advanced in this century alone, from masturbatory madness to dopamine deficiency, run into the hundreds, if not thousands. Methods of curing mental illnesses are equally numerous. Thus, seeing through the riddle of mental illness is not so much like seeing that the emperor is naked, but rather more like realizing that the emperor's wardrobe is rich and dazzling beyond the dreams even of emperors, but that there is no emperor.